At my retirement gala in front of the mayor and 300 investors, my own son got in my face and shouted, "You are washed up, old man. The empire is mine now." The entire ballroom went dead silent. He stood there smirking, thinking he had finally won, thinking he had successfully stripped a 72-year-old man of his life work. I did not yell. I just picked up the microphone, looked him dead in the eye, and said 6 words that made the blood drain from his face. "You just inherited a federal indictment. Before I tell you exactly how I legally and ruthlessly buried my own flesh and blood, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that respect is earned and not inherited." It all started 3 weeks before that gala, right in my own kitchen. I was standing in the shadows of the hallway, completely out of sight. My daughter-in-law Vanessa was standing by the marble island. She thought she was alone in the house. I watched her perfectly manicured hands reach for my daily pill organizer. She opened the Tuesday slot, took out my prescribed blood pressure medication, and replaced it with a small, unfamiliar blue pill. Then she slipped my real medication into her designer pocket and casually walked out humming a cheerful tune as if she had not just tried to drug a senior citizen. I did not scream. I did not storm into the kitchen and confront her. When you grow up surviving the gritty streets of the south side of Chicago, you learn very early that loud reactions get you killed. Silence gives you power. I waited until I heard her footsteps retreat upstairs. Then I walked into the kitchen and picked up the blue pill. I recognized it immediately. It was a heavy prescription sedative, the kind of pill that causes severe hallucinations, memory loss, and extreme confusion in people my age. I crushed the blue pill in a paper napkin, threw it in the trash, and replaced it with a harmless daily vitamin. When Vanessa came back downstairs 5 minutes later, I poured a glass of water and swallowed the vitamin right in front of her. She smiled, her eyes gleaming with a sick, twisted satisfaction. I smiled back, pretending to be the oblivious old man she thought I was. "My name is Calvin Sterling. I am 72 years old. 5 years ago, I buried Vivian, my beautiful wife, and the only woman who ever truly understood the weight of my ambitions. Since she passed, this sprawling estate has felt like an empty museum. 2 months ago, I had a minor heart procedure. It was nothing serious, just a standard stent placement to keep the blood flowing smoothly. But my son Derek and his wife Vanessa treated it like I had 1 foot in the grave. They moved into my guest wing, claiming they needed to monitor my recovery and help me around the house. But they were not monitoring my health. They were monitoring my empire. I built Sterling Logistics from a single rusted delivery truck into a $300 million supply chain juggernaut. I poured my blood, my sweat, and my tears into that company so Derek would never have to know what it felt like to be hungry. I paid for his expensive private schools. I paid for his Ivy League education. I gave him a vice president title at my company. But Derek did not inherit my work ethic or my street smarts. He inherited an inflated sense of entitlement. That arrogance was amplified perfectly by Vanessa, a woman who secretly looked down her nose at my South Side roots while happily spending the millions of dollars those roots produced. I knew they were greedy, but I never imagined they would cross the line into physical harm. Catching Vanessa swapping my medication changed everything. It meant my life was actively in danger. That evening, I decided to give them the show they were so desperately waiting for. As we sat down in the formal dining room for dinner, I let my hand shake as I reached for my drink. I knocked over my heavy crystal water glass, letting the cold water spill all over the expensive mahogany table. I did not apologize. Instead, I stared blankly at the wall, letting my jaw go slack, pretending to be deeply confused and disoriented. Vanessa immediately grabbed Derek by the arm, acting overly concerned. "Oh my goodness. Calvin, are you all right?" she asked, though her voice completely lacked any real warmth or empathy. Derek stood up quickly, tossing a towel over the spilled water. "Dad, you are completely out of it," he said, looking down at me. "You have been slipping for weeks, but this is getting bad. You need help. You cannot even hold a glass of water anymore." I kept my eyes unfocused, acting as if I could barely process his words. Derek quickly left the dining room and came back seconds later holding a thick leather folder. He placed a heavy stack of legal papers right in front of my dinner plate. I blinked hard, playing the part of a fragile, fading man, and forced my eyes to focus on the bold letters at the top of the page. It read, "Emergency medical power of attorney and full asset delegation." My mind was razor sharp. I knew exactly what this document was. If my pen touched that paper, Derek would have immediate and uncontested control over my medical decisions. Worse, he would have total executive control over Sterling Logistics and all my personal bank accounts. He could sell the company, liquidate my assets, or run my life work into the ground, and I would be completely powerless to stop him. "Come on, Dad," Derek said, uncapping a heavy gold pen and forcibly pressing it into my deliberately trembling hand. "Your heart is weak. Your mind is fading fast. You cannot handle the stress of the business or your own health anymore. Just sign this document. It gives me the legal authority to take care of everything for you." Vanessa nodded, stepping closer to my chair and placing a cold hand on my shoulder. "It is for your own good, Calvin," she said softly. "We just want you to rest. You have worked hard enough. Let Derek take the burden off your shoulders." I looked down at the pen in my hand. I looked at the son I had raised, a man who was willing to let his wife drug his own father just to steal a signature. I needed time. I needed to get out of this house to gather evidence and build an ironclad case against them. I could not just refuse to sign, because if they realized I was completely lucid, they would find another much more dangerous way to get rid of me. So I did the only logical thing a man in my position could do. I let my eyes roll back into my head. I dropped the gold pen onto the floor. I let out a deep, raspy gasp, clutching my chest, and I collapsed completely out of my dining chair, hitting the Persian rug with a heavy thud. As I lay there on the floor, perfectly conscious but pretending to be passed out, I heard Vanessa curse loudly. "Damn it, Derek," she yelled, dropping her fake sweet voice entirely. He fainted before he could sign the paper. "Get him up. Splash some water on his face. We need that signature tonight." I kept my breathing shallow, listening to their true colors bleed out into the room. They thought I was a weak, dying old man who was completely at their mercy. But the truth was, the street-smart kid from the South Side had just woken up, and he was about to teach them a brutal lesson they would never survive. I woke up the next morning to the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. The room smelled of industrial bleach and crisp, sterile linens. I was lying in a private VIP suite at Chicago General Hospital. My son and his wife had rushed me here the night before, playing the role of terrified children to absolute perfection. They stood by my bedside, weeping for the doctors, begging them to save their fragile old father. But the moment the visiting hours ended and they walked out of those double doors, I sat up in bed and tore the oxygen tube away from my face. I was not fragile, and my heart was beating with the steady rhythm of a man preparing for war. The door clicked open and Dr. Marcus Carter walked in. Carter was not just a cardiologist. He was a brother to me. We grew up on the exact same block on the South Side, dodging the same street corners and surviving the same cold winters. When he checked the hallway and locked the door behind him, he looked at me and shook his head. He told me my vital signs were stronger than a man half my age and asked me what kind of game I was playing. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I was hunting rats in my own house. I asked him to keep me admitted for 3 more days. I needed Derek and Vanessa to believe I was completely incapacitated. Carter did not ask any questions. He simply charted a fake diagnosis of severe exhaustion and mild cognitive decline. It gave me the perfect alibi. While I was confined to that hospital bed, my real work began. I grabbed my secure burner phone and made a call to an old associate named Malik. Malik was a ghost in this city. He specialized in corporate espionage and high-end security systems. I gave him the master bypass codes to my estate. I told him to bypass the perimeter alarms, slip into my home study, and plant a military-grade micro-audio transmitter directly underneath my solid mahogany desk. That study was my absolute sanctuary. It was where I built the Sterling Logistics empire from nothing. I knew that with me out of the house, Derek would immediately claim that room as his own. He was far too arrogant to resist sitting in my chair. Malik texted me less than 2 hours later. The device was active and the audio feed was routed directly to a secure application on my phone. That evening, as the city lights of Chicago began to flicker through my hospital window, I put a small wireless earpiece into my right ear. I opened the application and tapped the screen. The audio was crystal clear. I could hear the familiar clinking of crystal glasses. Derek was pouring my most expensive scotch. I heard Vanessa let out a high-pitched, satisfied laugh. They were celebrating. They were standing in the very room where I had sweated and bled over blueprints and contracts to secure their futures, and they were drinking my liquor to toast my downfall. I closed my eyes and listened as Vanessa began to speak. Her voice was dripping with a toxic elite arrogance that made my stomach turn. She told Derek how much she hated my house. She said the decor was tacky and completely lacked class. But then her words turned much darker. She started talking about the foundation of my empire. Sterling Logistics was built on developing affordable housing and supply chain routes through the South Side, providing jobs and secure homes for my community. Vanessa called my life work ghetto trash. She said she was physically sick of being associated with hood projects and urban charity. She laughed and told Derek that the moment I was locked away in a psychiatric ward, they were going to sell off the entire South Side division to Vanguard Holdings. My jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached. Vanguard Holdings was a ruthless corporate rival run by a group of wealthy white developers who had been trying to gentrify and tear down my community for 20 years. I had fought them tooth and nail in the boardrooms and in the city council to protect my people. And now my own daughter-in-law, a woman who had never worked a hard day in her life, was planning to hand my community over to them for a quick payout. She insulted my heritage. She mocked the color of my skin and the very soil I came from. She told Derek they needed to wash the Sterling name clean of its street-level origins. And the absolute worst part was hearing my son, my own flesh and blood, softly agree with her. He told her she was right, and that it was finally time to elevate the family brand away from the slums. I thought I had heard the worst of it. I thought their greed and their deep prejudice were the bottom of the barrel. But then Derek began to speak about the money, and the temperature in my hospital room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I heard the sound of thick papers shuffling across my desk. Derek told Vanessa to calm down and focus on the immediate prize. He told her not to worry about the Vanguard deal just yet because the $50 million loan had just been officially approved. I sat up straight in my hospital bed. $50 million. My company carried no such debt. I ran a tight ship, and I absolutely despised unnecessary leverage. I listened closely as Derek explained the mechanics of his ultimate betrayal. He bragged to his wife about how he had successfully forged my signature and used my emergency medical power of attorney drafts to secure a massive corporate loan through a shadow banking syndicate. He told her the funds were going to be dispersed by the end of the week straight into the company accounts. Vanessa sounded nervous for a brief second. She asked him what would happen when the auditors or the federal bank regulators came looking for the missing money. Derek just laughed. It was a cold, calculating sound that stripped away any remaining love I ever had for him. He explained his master plan with terrifying precision. He said that by the time the bank realized the money was missing from the corporate accounts, I would already be permanently committed to a high-security psychiatric facility. He told Vanessa that the $50 million debt was tied entirely to my name and my personal guarantor status. When I went down for severe dementia, the massive debt would go down with me. The company would declare bankruptcy under my failing leadership, and the $50 million in cash would already be washed and hidden in their offshore shell accounts in the Cayman Islands. He said the words so casually. He told her, "Do not worry, the loan is in the old man name. When he goes to the psych ward, the debt goes with him and the cash belongs to us." I pulled the earpiece out of my ear. My hands were completely steady. The shock was gone. The deep sorrow of a betrayed father was entirely gone. I was no longer looking at a misguided son making a foolish mistake. I was looking at a highly dangerous financial predator who was actively trying to destroy my life, my freedom, and my entire legacy. If this fraudulent loan went through and I was declared mentally incompetent, I would not just lose my company, I would be left completely bankrupt. My reputation would be shattered. The federal government would eventually step in and I could spend my final years facing criminal fraud charges while locked heavily inside a medical prison. They were going to steal my fortune and leave me holding the $50 million corpse of my own empire. I looked out the hospital window at the sprawling Chicago skyline. I had spent 40 long years building my name in this city, and I was not about to let a spoiled child and his racist wife tear it down in a single week. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of corporate fraud. But they forgot one very crucial detail. They learned everything they knew from me. And I was about to show them exactly why you never back an old lion into a corner. I grabbed my clothes from the hospital closet. I was done resting. I needed to assemble my war council, and I needed to prepare a massive poison pill that would make them choke on their own unchecked greed. The digital clock next to my hospital bed glowed an eerie green. It was exactly 3 a.m. The halls of Chicago General were dead silent except for the squeak of a nurse's shoes at the far end of the corridor. I slipped out of the stiff hospital bed and changed into the dark clothes I had stashed in the closet. I did not use the main elevator. A man who builds skyscrapers knows exactly where the service stairs are. The cold Chicago wind hit my face the moment I pushed open the heavy steel exit door in the alleyway. I pulled my coat tight and walked 2 blocks to a 24-hour diner where a black town car was already waiting with the engine running. I climbed into the back seat. My driver, a loyal man who had been with me for 2 decades, nodded once and pulled into the empty streets. We drove downtown to a towering glass high-rise that pierced the night sky. I bypassed the lobby security with a private key card and took the private elevator straight to the penthouse level. The doors opened into a sprawling office lined with dark oak bookshelves and panoramic windows overlooking the sleeping city. Standing by the glass, pouring 2 glasses of neat bourbon, was Desmond. Desmond was not just a corporate attorney. He was a legal heavyweight, a shark in a tailored suit, and the only man alive who knew where all my bodies were buried. We had grown up on the same violent block in the South Side. While I learned to mix concrete and negotiate building permits, Desmond learned how to weaponize the law. He was ruthless, brilliant, and absolutely loyal to the blood we had shed together. I walked over and took the glass of bourbon. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I placed my phone on his massive mahogany desk and played the audio recording of Derek and Vanessa. Desmond stood perfectly still, listening to my own son plot my financial and mental destruction. He listened to Vanessa call my legacy ghetto trash. His jaw tightened, but his expression remained completely unreadable. When the recording finished, Desmond finished his bourbon in one slow swallow and set the glass down hard. He walked over to his computer and began typing rapidly. His fingers moved with aggressive precision. Desmond had access to financial networks that most federal agents did not even know existed. He tapped into the shadow banking registries, the private lending syndicates that operated just outside the reach of standard regulations. For 10 agonizing minutes, the only sound in the office was the clicking of his keyboard. Then he stopped and turned the monitor toward me. "There it is, Calvin," he said, his voice dangerously low. I looked at the screen. It was a scanned copy of a master loan agreement. The principal amount was exactly $50 million. The lender was a notorious offshore private equity firm known for destroying companies and liquidating their assets. And right at the bottom of the last page was my signature. It was a nearly perfect forgery. To an untrained eye, it looked exactly like my handwriting. But I knew the subtle curves of my own penmanship, and I knew I had never signed that paper. "Derek used your emergency medical power of attorney draft to bypass the notary requirements," Desmond explained. "He leveraged the entire equity of Sterling Logistics to secure the cash. The funds are scheduled to be dispersed into a holding account by the end of the month. If he succeeds, you are completely liable for $50 million. If you are committed to a psychiatric ward, the creditors will immediately seize your company to cover the debt. They will tear your life work to pieces, and your son will walk away clean with the cash hidden in untraceable offshore accounts." A violent surge of anger rushed through my veins. I reached for my phone. I told Desmond to call the FBI director in the Chicago field office immediately. I wanted Derek arrested before breakfast. I wanted him in handcuffs facing 20 years for federal wire fraud and forgery. I wanted Vanessa stripped of her designer clothes and thrown into a holding cell. But Desmond slammed his hand down on the desk, stopping me. He looked at me with cold, calculating eyes and told me to think like a king and not like a street brawler. "If you call the feds right now, Calvin, what do you think happens to Sterling Logistics?" Desmond asked, his voice slicing through my anger. "The FBI will freeze every single corporate account you own. The news will break by noon. Your stock will absolutely plummet. Your investors will pull out in pure panic. The banks will halt all your construction projects across the South Side. 3,000 hard-working people will lose their jobs by Friday. You will destroy the very empire you are trying to save just to punish a foolish boy." I slowly lowered my phone. Desmond was right. A direct attack would result in mutually assured destruction. If I burned Derek down today, I would burn my 40 years of hard work right along with him. The people in my community, the families who relied on my paychecks, they would be the ones to suffer the most. I could not let Vanguard Holdings or any other rival swoop in and buy my company for pennies on the dollar just because my son was a greedy criminal. I sat down heavily in the leather chair across from Desmond. The realization of the trap was suffocating. Derek had tied the bomb directly to the heart of my company. If I cut the wire too fast, the whole thing explodes. I looked at Desmond and asked him how we survive this without losing the company. Desmond leaned against the glass window looking out at the city. A dark, menacing smile slowly spread across his face. "We do not stop the bomb, Calvin," he said softly. "We simply make sure Derek is the only one holding it when it goes off. You cannot attack him directly, so we are going to build a poison pill." I listened closely as Desmond laid out the strategy. It was a masterpiece of legal warfare. If Derek wanted the company and the $50 million debt so badly, we were going to give it to him. But we were going to make sure that the company he inherited was nothing but a hollow shell. We needed to surgically remove the actual value of Sterling Logistics, the real estate titles, the lucrative supply chain contracts, the heavy equipment assets, and transfer them to a secure anonymous holding entity. But there was a catch. To make the transfer legally bulletproof without alerting the creditors, we needed Derek to voluntarily accept full operational liability on paper. We needed him to sign a final legally binding executive transfer agreement while he was completely sober and acting as the incoming chief executive officer. We needed him to claim the throne publicly. Desmond looked at me and said, "We have to play along. You have to go back to that house tomorrow and pretend that you are a broken, fading old man. You have to let him think he is outsmarting you. You have to let him plan his grand coronation. Let him organize your retirement party. Let him invite the mayor and the investors. Let him stand on a stage and declare himself the king. Because the higher he climbs, the harder he is going to fall when we pull the floor out from under him." I stood up from the leather chair. The anger in my chest had transformed into something much colder and far more dangerous. I was no longer a victim trying to survive a family betrayal. I was the architect of their absolute destruction. I told Desmond to start drafting the corporate restructuring papers immediately. I told him to build the shell company and prepare the asset transfers. I walked back out into the freezing Chicago night. I was going back to the hospital. Tomorrow morning I would walk back into my house leaning heavily on a cane, pretending my mind was slipping away. I would look my son and his toxic wife in the eyes and I would smile. They wanted to steal my empire, but they had no idea they were walking straight into a legal slaughterhouse. The trap was set, and I was ready to play my part flawlessly. The next morning, I pulled up to the towering glass facade of the Sterling Logistics headquarters in downtown Chicago. For 40 years, I had walked through those massive double doors with my spine completely straight and my shoulders squared like a heavyweight fighter. I was the undisputed king of my domain, a man who built a concrete empire from the dirt of the South Side. But today, I needed to play the role of the court jester. I stepped out of the black town car and leaned heavily on a polished wooden cane. I forced my left hand to tremble slightly. I slowed my pace down deliberately, dragging my feet across the polished marble floor of the main lobby. I could feel the heavy stares of my employees bearing down on me. The security guards who usually greeted me with crisp, professional nods now looked at me with deep, worried expressions. The receptionists whispered quietly behind their hands as I passed by. I kept my eyes dull and my breathing shallow. I wanted them to talk. I wanted the rumors to spread like wildfire that the great Calvin Sterling was finally breaking down and losing his grip. The walls of a corporate building always talk, and I needed Derek to hear the echoes of my rapid decline before I even reached the executive floor. I took the private elevator up to the top level. My corner office overlooked the sprawling Chicago skyline, a beautiful, ruthless city I had helped build from the ground up. I shuffled slowly into the room and sank into my large leather chair, letting out a long, exhausted sigh that echoed in the quiet space. I picked up my desk phone and told my assistant to send Derek in immediately. Less than a minute later, my son walked confidently through the heavy oak door. He was wearing a tailored designer suit that cost more than my very first delivery truck. He carried himself with a sickening, unearned arrogance. He glanced at my wooden cane leaning against the desk, and a faint, smug smile crossed his face before he quickly hid it behind a thick mask of fake concern. He asked me how I was feeling today. I looked at him with tired, defeated eyes and let my voice crack just a little bit. I told him I was incredibly tired. I said the recent hospital stay had really taken the life out of me, and that my heart was just not what it used to be. I told him the doctors had warned me that the massive stress of running a $300 million logistics empire was going to put me in an early grave if I did not stop. Derek stepped closer, resting his soft, manicured hands on my desk. He used that smooth, manipulative tone he and Vanessa had perfected over the years. He said I needed to rest and finally let the next generation take the wheel. I nodded slowly, playing the part of the broken, fading patriarch to absolute perfection. I told him he was right. I said I was officially stepping down and taking early retirement effective at the end of the month. I told him we would make the grand announcement at the upcoming company anniversary gala, and that I would publicly hand over the title of Chief Executive Officer directly to him in front of the mayor, the press, and all of our major investors. The raw greed in his eyes was so intensely bright it practically illuminated the entire room. He thanked me profusely and promised he would make the Sterling name proud. It took every single ounce of street-earned self-control I possessed not to reach across that desk and slap the arrogant smirk right off his face. But Derek was not just there for a fancy title. A title is just a meaningless word on a business card. He wanted the absolute keys to the kingdom. He leaned in closer and lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. He said that since I was stepping down and focusing entirely on my failing health, we needed to ensure the family assets were fully protected from any corporate turbulence. He asked me directly for the master access codes to the Sterling Family Trust. The trust was the ultimate financial fortress that held our liquid assets, our offshore accounts, and the physical deeds to our real estate empire. If he got the master code today, he could completely drain the accounts before the gala even happened. I was perfectly ready for this exact move. I let my hand shake violently as I opened my desk drawer. I pulled out a piece of company stationery and fumbled awkwardly for a pen. I told him my memory was getting terribly, would allow him to view the account balances and manage minor day-to-day transfers, but it would not allow him to liquidate the core assets or change the beneficiary structures. Derek frowned deeply, clearly frustrated by the limitation. He asked why he could not just have the primary master code right now if he was going to be the new head of the family. I let out a weak, painful cough and rubbed my temples, acting as if the simple conversation was draining my very last drop of energy. I told him the master digital code was too complex for my failing mind to remember right now. Then I casually dropped the ultimate bait. I lowered my voice to a raspy whisper and told him he did not need the master digital code anyway. I told him that my original last will and testament, along with the physical bearer bonds and the master trust override documents, were locked safely inside the biometric wall safe hidden behind the large oil painting in my home study at the estate. I promised him that once the transition was complete at the gala, I would open the safe myself and hand everything over to him legally. I watched his posture change instantly. He had the information he truly wanted. He patted my shoulder gently, told me to rest my weary head, and practically sprinted out of my office to share the news. I sat completely alone in the cold silence of my office. I pulled out my secure burner phone and connected to the live audio feed from the hidden microphone Malik had planted under my desk at the house. I knew Derek would call Vanessa the very second he had an update on the money. Sure enough, a few minutes later, the audio feed cracked to life in my earpiece. I heard the sound of Derek pacing back and forth in my home study. I heard Vanessa ask him what happened with the old man. Derek laughed a loud, cruel, arrogant laugh that echoed through the hidden microphone. He told his wife the old man was completely broken and washed up. He said I showed up to work with a cane shaking like a fragile leaf and practically begging to give the entire company away to him. Vanessa let out a high-pitched squeal of pure delight. She said she knew the hospital stay would finally break my stubborn spirit. She called me a weak, pathetic fossil who was finally stepping aside for the superior generation. She said the ghetto king is finally dead, and now the real royalty takes over the estate. Her racist entitlement was a disgusting poison, but I let it wash over me calmly because I knew the legal cure I was preparing would be absolutely fatal to her luxurious lifestyle. Then Derek told her all about the upcoming gala. He said in just a few weeks he would be the official untouchable CEO of Sterling Logistics. But he also told her about the minor problem with the secondary trust code. He explained that I did not give him the master keys to the fortune just yet. Vanessa went dead quiet for a long moment. Then I heard her high heels walking slowly across the hardwood floor of my study. I heard the faint sound of the heavy oil painting sliding against the wall. She had found the hidden safe. She asked Derek exactly what was inside it. Derek repeated the lie I had so carefully planted in his greedy head. He told her the master will and the bearer bonds were locked inside waiting for them. He said they just needed to play nice and wait until the gala and I would open it for them willingly. But I knew Vanessa better than she knew herself. I knew her toxic greed was far too impatient to wait for anything. She told Derek that waiting was way too risky. She said my mind was fading entirely too fast. And what if I suddenly forgot the safe combination? Or what if I changed my mind in a moment of senile paranoia? She told him they needed that master will right now to ensure the fraudulent $50 million loan went through without a single hitch. Derek asked her how they were supposed to get into a military-grade biometric safe that required my specific fingerprint and a complex digital passcode. Vanessa laughed, her voice dripping with pure calculated malice. She told him not to worry about the security. She said I was a very heavy sleeper, and the extra sedatives she had been secretly crushing into my evening tea were making me practically comatose at night anyway. She said all she needed was a silicone mold of my right thumb while I slept, and a little bit of uninterrupted time to crack the digital keypad using a bypass tool she could buy online. She proudly announced that she would break into the safe and steal the master will before the week was over. I sat in my quiet corner office listening to the venomous plans of the woman living under my own roof. They thought they were outsmarting a dying man. They thought I was surrendering my life work out of pure fear. But they had absolutely no idea that the document sitting inside that safe was a highly weaponized forgery created by Desmond and myself. It was a poison pill document designed to trigger an immediate aggressive financial audit that would expose their fraudulent $50 million loan the very second they tried to use it. I turned off the audio feed and leaned back in my chair. I looked at the wooden cane resting against my desk. I picked it up, felt its weight for a moment, and tossed it into the far corner of the room. The fragile old man routine had worked flawlessly. Derek was blinded by his own impending coronation, and Vanessa was too busy planning a midnight heist to realize she was walking straight into a devastating steel trap. They wanted to steal my legacy in the dark, but I was going to let them step right into the blazing spotlight first. I grabbed my suit jacket and walked out of the office, my stride perfectly steady and strong. Let them plan their robbery. Let them celebrate their hollow victory. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the countdown to their absolute destruction had officially begun. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 2 in the morning. The sprawling Chicago estate was completely silent, wrapped in the freezing winter night. I was sitting perfectly still in my high-backed leather chair tucked deep into the darkest corner of my home study. I had not taken the sleeping pills Vanessa had left on my nightstand earlier that evening. Instead, I had flushed them down the drain and poured myself a single glass of neat bourbon, waiting in the shadows like a predator perfectly camouflaged in the brush. I knew she was coming. I knew her greed would not let her wait until the morning. Right on schedule, the heavy oak door of my study clicked open. The hinges were completely silent because I always kept them well oiled. A sliver of pale moonlight spilled across the Persian rug, followed by the slender silhouette of my daughter-in-law. She was dressed entirely in black, moving with a nervous, desperate energy. She carried a small flashlight in her mouth and a canvas tool roll in her hands. I watched her glide across the room, entirely unaware that the man she thought was comatose upstairs was sitting less than 10 feet away, watching her every single move. She walked straight to the large oil painting of the Chicago skyline, pushed it aside, and revealed the cold steel face of my biometric wall safe. She pulled a small, semi-transparent object from her pocket. It was the silicone thumb mold she had proudly bragged about to my son. She pressed it against the scanner and attached a digital bypass device to the keypad. As she worked feverishly to crack my security, my mind drifted back to the very first time I saw her true colors. It was 3 years ago, right in this very room. Vanessa had marched in demanding a $2 million loan to open a chain of high-end luxury beauty salons. She was not asking me for a favor. She was demanding it as if it was her birthright. She presented a business plan that was nothing but glossy pictures and empty buzzwords with absolutely no financial foundation or market research. I told her no. I told her I built my empire hauling concrete and negotiating brutal city contracts on the South Side, and I did not fund vanity projects for people who had never broken a sweat in their entire lives. She looked at me that day with a deeply venomous hatred. She called me a stingy old dinosaur holding on to money I could not take to the grave. She insulted the way I spoke and the way I handled my wealth. From that exact moment, I knew she was a dangerous parasite. She was a woman who believed she deserved the fruits of my lifelong labor simply because she managed to put a wedding ring on my foolish son. This midnight robbery was not just about securing the company for Derek. For Vanessa, this was deeply personal. This was her twisted version of revenge against the man who refused to hand over his wallet. She wanted to strip me of my dignity and my legacy while I was helpless. But I was far from helpless. The safe let out a soft mechanical click. A green light flashed in the dark room. She had done it. Vanessa let out a shaky breath of pure triumph and pulled the heavy steel door open. She reached inside and pulled out the thick manila envelope sealed with red wax. She could not resist the urge to look. She turned on her small flashlight and broke the seal, pulling out the crisp legal documents. It was the fake last will and testament that Desmond and I had carefully drafted just 48 hours prior. I watched her eyes scan the first page. Even in the dim light, I could see her face completely light up with a sick sense of victory. She folded the papers, stuffed them into her jacket, closed the safe, and pulled the painting back into place. She slipped out of the room like a ghost, leaving me sitting in the quiet darkness, sipping the last drop of my bourbon. I waited 5 minutes before I pulled out my secure burner phone and activated the audio feed from the kitchen. I knew she would not wait until morning to share the prize with my son. I put the earpiece in and listened. I heard the rustling of papers, and Derek gasping in absolute disbelief. "You actually got it," he whispered, sounding equal parts terrified and thrilled. "Read it," Vanessa demanded, her voice trembling with pure adrenaline. "Read the asset distribution clause right now." Derek began to read the legal jargon out loud, and then he stopped dead in his tracks. The silence in the kitchen was heavy and thick. "What is it?" she asked impatiently. Derek read the specific poison pill clause Desmond and I had planted deep inside the document. It stated that in the event of my medical incapacitation or my formal retirement, all liquid assets, corporate holdings, and real estate properties under the Sterling Trust are to be immediately liquidated into untraceable cash equivalents within 7 standard business days to prepare for an external corporate buyout. Vanessa gasped loudly. 7 days, she whispered. If he liquidates the physical assets, the company becomes a massive cash fortress, but we lose all control of the actual infrastructure. We cannot let that happen. Derek was breathing heavily now, his voice rising in sheer panic. "No, you do not understand," he told her. "The $50 million shadow loan I took out is secured entirely against the physical real estate and the supply chain infrastructure. If the trust automatically liquidates those assets in 7 days, the shadow bank will know the collateral is completely gone. They will freeze the loan, and they will come after me. They will actually kill me, Vanessa. They will kill me if I do not deliver that money before the assets vanish." I sat in the dark study, listening to the absolute terror in my son's voice. The trap had snapped shut exactly as I planned. The fake will did not just give them false hope. It put a ticking time bomb right in their laps. By making them believe the entire company would be sold off in 7 days, I was forcing their hand. "We have to pull the $50 million out right now," Derek stammered. "Tomorrow morning, before the old man makes his retirement speech at the gala and triggers the liquidation clause. We have to drain the account, wire the cash offshore immediately, and run before the shadow bank or the federal regulators figure out what we did." Vanessa tried to calm him down, telling him they just needed to stick to the plan and execute the wire transfer as soon as the banks opened. She told him he was the acting executive and he had the power to move the funds. But I could hear the desperation creeping into her voice too. Their perfect plan to slowly bleed me dry had just turned into a frantic race for their own survival. I took the earpiece out and smiled in the dark. They thought they had successfully robbed a senile old man. They thought they were holding the master key to my fortune, but all they were holding was a match, and they had just decided to light it while standing inside a room full of gasoline. Derek was going to panic and try to move $50 million of fraudulent money in broad daylight. And when he did, he would be leaving a massive, undeniable paper trail that would lead the authorities right to his front door. The board was set, and the final pieces were moving exactly where I wanted them. 48 hours after Vanessa broke into my safe, I was sitting in the basement archives of Desmond's law firm. The air down there smelled like old paper and cold concrete. We were completely off the grid. There were no digital traces and no cell phones allowed in this room. Just me, my oldest friend, and a massive mountain of legal documents that represented 40 years of my blood, sweat, and tears. We were about to perform what Desmond called corporate surgery. I called it gutting the pig. Sterling Logistics was a massive beast of a company. It owned 50 commercial warehouses, a fleet of 3,000 heavy transport trucks, and a portfolio of logistics patents that practically ran the supply chain of the entire Midwest. Derek thought he was inheriting that entire beast. He thought the $50 million shadow loan he forged in my name was perfectly secured against all that heavy machinery and prime real estate. My son was a fool. He only understood the glossy surface of power. He never understood the plumbing underneath. Desmond spread the master deeds across the long metal table. Over the next 6 hours, we systematically severed every single valuable asset from Sterling Logistics. We transferred the warehouse deeds, the truck titles, the government contracts, and the technology patents into a newly formed anonymous shell company called Obsidian Trust. I was the sole unlisted beneficiary of Obsidian. We moved the assets legally, quietly, and completely under the radar using loopholes that Desmond had spent decades mastering. By the time the sun came up over the Chicago skyline, Sterling Logistics was completely gutted. On paper, it still looked like a $300 million titan. but in reality it was nothing more than a hollowed-out carcass. It owned 0 buildings. It owned 0 trucks. It owned absolutely nothing but the corporate name, the office furniture, and the massive $50 million debt Derek had illegally tied to it. I sat back in my chair and looked at the final stack of transfer papers. It was a strange feeling dismantling the empire I had built with my own 2 hands. I remembered laying the first bricks of our very first warehouse in the South Side. I remembered the long nights, the negotiations, the endless hustle to build a legacy so my family would never know poverty. And now I was stripping it all down to a skeleton just to survive my own flesh and blood. But you cannot save an infected limb. You have to amputate it to save the body. Desmond looked up from the documents and rubbed his tired eyes. He poured us both a cup of black coffee. He told me the deed was done. Sterling Logistics was now legally bankrupt and operating entirely on ghost equity. He said when the shadow bank creditors came looking to collect their $50 million, they would find nothing but empty file cabinets and a useless corporate logo. But there was a catch. There is always a catch when you are dealing with federal fraud and dangerous shadow syndicates. Desmond leaned across the table and told me that the trap was only 99% complete. The forged $50 million loan was still technically under my name. The shadow bank did not care about corporate structure. They only cared about the signature on the dotted line. If they realized the company was hollow, they would come after me personally. They would drag me into endless lawsuits, and I would have to spend the rest of my life in courtrooms trying to prove that my son forged my signature. I did not have years to waste. I needed the trap to snap shut on Derek's neck so tightly that he could never escape. Desmond explained the crucial missing piece. We needed Derek to voluntarily accept full operational and financial liability for Sterling Logistics. We needed him to sign a specific executive transfer agreement that legally transferred all corporate debts, obligations, and liabilities directly to him as the incoming chief executive officer. And he needed to do it willingly, completely sober, and in front of unimpeachable witnesses. I knew exactly where and when that was going to happen. The company anniversary gala. Derek was planning to use the gala as his grand coronation. He wanted to stand on a brightly lit stage in front of the mayor, our biggest investors, and the local press to officially take the crown from his sick, fading father. He was going to present me with the transition papers, expecting me to weakly sign over the empire while the crowd applauded his succession. But Desmond had drafted a very special version of those transition papers. Hidden deep within the dense legal clauses was a full assumption of debt and total liability transfer. The moment Derek put his pen to that document, he would formally acknowledge and adopt every single financial liability tied to Sterling Logistics, including the fraudulent $50 million loan. He would be placing his own head directly into the noose and kicking the chair away himself. It was a brilliant, flawless plan. But waiting for the gala was highly dangerous. The event was still 2 weeks away, and Derek was getting incredibly desperate. After reading the fake will Vanessa had stolen from my safe, he firmly believed the company assets were going to be automatically liquidated in exactly 7 days. I knew his panic would force him to make a drastic move. He would try to pull the $50 million out of the corporate accounts before the gala even happened. He would try to wire the cash to his offshore shell accounts to pay off his dangerous gambling debts and secure his own wealth before the supposed liquidation wiped him out. I needed eyes on him constantly. I needed to know his every single move, every wire transfer, every panicked phone call he made from his executive suite. I told Desmond we needed a spy on the inside. I could not be at the office to watch him. I had to stay at the estate and maintain the illusion of a broken old man recovering from heart surgery and losing his mind. I needed someone inside the corporate headquarters who could monitor Derek's financial transactions and gather the hard, irrefutable evidence of his embezzlement. I needed someone completely invisible to him. Someone he would brush off and underestimate just like he underestimated me. Desmond nodded slowly and reached into his briefcase. He pulled out a thin personnel file and slid it across the metal table. He said he had already anticipated that exact problem. I opened the file and looked at the photograph attached to the first page. It was a profile of a young, brilliant forensic accountant working in the lower basement levels of our finance department. Her name was Maya. She was a sharp, highly ambitious African-American woman from the exact same South Side neighborhood where I grew up. Desmond told me she was the smartest auditor in the entire building. She had caught 3 different accounting errors last quarter alone, but Derek had completely ignored her reports because she did not fit into his elite corporate inner circle. He viewed her as just another low-level numbers cruncher. I looked at Maya's impressive credentials and smiled for the first time all night. She was absolutely perfect. Derek was too busy looking up at the throne to notice the people working down in the engine room. I was going to turn Maya into the most dangerous financial assassin in the city of Chicago, and my arrogant son would never even see her coming. The corporate surgery was complete. Now it was time to let the infection bleed out. I needed to place a financial assassin right inside the lion's den. The next morning I shuffled into the executive boardroom leaning heavily on my polished wooden cane. Derek was sitting behind his massive glass desk, drowning in a sea of corporate paperwork. The fake 7-day liquidation clause from the forged will had him sweating right through his custom-tailored Italian suits. I played the part of the concerned failing father to absolute perfection. I told him he looked overwhelmed with the upcoming transition and that he desperately needed a dedicated assistant to handle the administrative overflow before his big coronation at the retirement gala. I told him I had found a quiet, obedient girl from the basement accounting pool who would do exactly whatever he asked without asking any unnecessary questions. Derek was far too arrogant and far too panicked to see the trap. He took one single look at Maya when she walked into his office. Maya was a young, unassuming black woman in a plain gray suit holding a notebook with her head bowed respectfully. Derek immediately dismissed her as a threat. He saw a young woman from the South Side and his elite prejudice blinded him completely. He thought she was just cheap, uneducated labor. He had absolutely no idea I had just handed him the keys to his own execution. Maya was a ghost in the machine. She was a brilliant forensic accountant who grew up on the exact same gritty streets I did. She understood the value of sterling logistics to our community, and she was fiercely loyal to the people Derek and Vanessa were trying to sell out. While Derek was busy making frantic phone calls to offshore bankers and shadow lenders trying to figure out how to wash the $50 million loan, Maya was quietly dissecting his private ledgers. We had a highly encrypted communication channel set up. Every single night she would send me updates that made my blood boil with a cold, calculated rage. Derek was not just forging my name for a massive shadow loan. He had been bleeding my operating accounts dry for months. Maya found a hidden expense account categorized as corporate vendor relations. But it was not paying any vendors. Derek was using my hard-earned company money to lease a luxury downtown penthouse for a 24-year-old mistress. He was buying her diamond necklaces and designer bags while coming home to his wife and smiling in my face telling me he was protecting the family legacy. But the absolute peak of his sociopathic audacity was the yacht. Maya uncovered a pending wire transfer for $2.5 million. Derek was secretly buying a custom luxury yacht registered entirely under Vanessa's name. He was draining the employee pension fund matching account to buy his racist, greedy wife a floating palace just to keep her quiet and happy while he slept with his mistress across town. The level of unchecked greed was staggering. He was burning down the house I built just to keep himself warm. It was Thursday afternoon, exactly 1 week before the gala. I was sitting in my corner office staring out at the freezing Chicago skyline when I received a panic signal on my secure burner phone. It was a blank text message from Maya. That was our prearranged code for immediate physical danger. I grabbed my cane and moved faster than I had all month, completely ignoring the fake limp I had been practicing. Down the hall in the executive suite, Derek had come back from a long liquid lunch completely unannounced. Maya was sitting at his computer transferring the master server files to an encrypted external drive. She was seconds away from a complete clone of his digital footprint when he walked through the door. When I reached the heavy glass doors of his office, I heard a terrifying sound. It was the sound of a heavy struggle and flesh hitting a desk. I pushed the door open to find my son cornering Maya against the mahogany desk. His face was twisted in a violent, ugly rage. He had grabbed her by the collar of her blouse, pinning her aggressively against the wood. His eyes were wild and wide with the paranoid panic of a cornered rat. He was screaming at her, asking what she was doing on his computer and demanding to know who she was working for. He raised his hand, rolling it into a tight fist, ready to strike a woman who was just trying to do her job. The boy I raised, the boy I sacrificed everything to protect, was about to brutally beat a defenseless woman to hide his stolen money. I could not let him hurt her, but I could not break my cover either. If I stepped in as the strong, capable, street-smart man I truly was, the entire operation would collapse in seconds. Derek would realize I was on to him and he would panic and flee the country with whatever cash he could grab. I had to use his own arrogance and his complete lack of respect for me against him. I slammed my heavy wooden cane hard against the glass door. The loud, sharp crack echoed like a gunshot through the room. I stumbled forward, putting on a pathetic display of a confused, angry old man. I yelled at the top of my lungs, demanding to know what all this unacceptable noise was about. I looked at Maya with pure, fake disgust. I pointed a shaking, wrinkled finger at her and screamed that she was completely incompetent. I told Derek I had hired her to organize his basic files, not to break his expensive computer systems. I acted like a paranoid senior citizen, shouting that these young kids today do not know how to follow simple basic instructions and that nobody respects company property anymore. I looked Maya dead in the eye and told her she was fired immediately. I demanded she pack her things and get out of my building right this second before I called the city police for trespassing. The psychological trick worked flawlessly. Derek immediately let go of her collar and took a step back. His violent, paranoid rage melted into a smug, satisfied grin. He adjusted his expensive suit jacket, thinking his senile old father had just blindly solved his massive security problem. He completely bought the illusion that I was just firing a clumsy, stupid employee who had accidentally messed up his computer. He apologized to me, saying she was snooping around where she did not belong and he had just caught her. I patted his shoulder with a trembling hand and told him that good, reliable help is impossible to find these days. Maya played her part like an absolute professional. She ran out of the office crying perfect crocodile tears, clutching her large leather purse tightly to her chest. She kept her head down and rushed to the elevator, looking exactly like a terrified fired assistant. Derek stood in his office looking incredibly proud of himself. He thought he was perfectly safe. He thought his dark financial secrets were completely secure. What my arrogant son did not know was that safely tucked inside the false bottom of Maya's purse was the encrypted flash drive containing every single dirty transaction he had ever made. She had successfully cloned the entire server right before he grabbed her. Later that night, I drove out to a secure diner on the south side to meet Maya. She was sitting in a back booth drinking black coffee. There were no tears now. Just the cold, hard focus of a woman who knew she had just secured the ultimate weapon. She slid the small black flash drive across the table. I told her she did a phenomenal job and that her future at the new Sterling Logistics was permanently secured. But her expression remained incredibly grim. She looked around the empty diner and leaned over the table. She told me the mistress and the luxury yacht were completely insignificant compared to what else she found on that drive. She said Derek was not just stealing money from the company accounts. He was actively committing corporate treason. Maya took a deep breath and told me that Derek had been having secret encrypted meetings with a man named Vance. My blood turned to absolute ice. Vance was a ruthless white developer and my oldest enemy. We had fought brutal wars over territory in Chicago since the early 80s. Vance was the man trying to gentrify the South Side and push my people out. And according to Maya, my own son had promised to sell Sterling Logistics to Vance for pennies on the dollar the moment he took over as chief executive officer. Derek was planning to hand my entire legacy over to the very man I had spent my entire life fighting. The betrayal was no longer just financial, it was total annihilation. I took the flash drive and walked out into the cold night knowing exactly what my next move had to be. Sitting in the cold basement of Desmond's law firm, I stared at the decrypted files Maya had pulled from my son's computer. The hidden folders were a roadmap of pure corporate treason. But it was not the fake invoices or the hidden offshore accounts that made my blood run cold. It was the name on the master acquisition contract. Arthur Vance. I felt a dangerous heat rising in my chest. Arthur Vance was a shark in a tailored suit, a ruthless real estate developer who made his fortune in the 80s by destroying black neighborhoods and replacing them with high-priced commercial concrete. Vance and I had fought a brutal, bitter war over city zoning contracts 30 years ago. I beat him. I humiliated him in front of the entire Chicago City Council and secured the South Side for my people. Vance swore he would bury me and erase my name from this city. Now my own son was handing him the shovel. The files showed a backdoor agreement that was highly illegal. Derek was not just selling Sterling Logistics. He was going to sell the entire company to Vance for 20 cents on the dollar the day after he officially took over as chief executive officer. It was a complete fire sale. In exchange, Vance would secretly absorb the fraudulent $50 million shadow loan and give Derek a $5 million offshore kickback. Derek was selling out his heritage, his community, and his father's legacy just to save his own skin and secure a quick payout. It was a massive antitrust violation and a blatant fraud against our investors. I needed them on tape talking about this illegal monopoly and the kickbacks. Desmond used his network to track Derek's movements. He found a private reservation under Vance's name at the most exclusive steakhouse in downtown Chicago for that exact evening. It was a place where corrupt politicians and corporate vultures cut dirty deals over $500 steaks. I knew what I had to do. I put on an oversized, slightly wrinkled suit. I did not shave and I did not comb my hair. I took my heavy wooden cane and I went hunting. I arrived at the restaurant pretending to be a confused elderly man who had wandered away from his caregivers. The hostess tried to stop me at the front podium, but I shuffled past her, putting on a perfectly pathetic display of severe dementia. I scanned the dim room filled with the smell of expensive wine and roasted meat. I found them in a private curved leather booth in the back corner. Arthur Vance was sitting there, his silver hair slicked back, raising a glass of dark red wine. Derek and Vanessa were sitting across from him, laughing loudly like they were his best friends. I gripped my cane and stumbled toward their table. I let my breathing get heavy and erratic. When I was 3 feet away, I called out Derek's name with a weak, trembling voice. The laughter at the table died instantly. Derek turned around and all the color completely drained from his face. He looked absolutely terrified. Arthur Vance slowly turned his head to look at me, and a wicked, satisfied smile spread across his wrinkled face. He was looking at the great Calvin Sterling, the man who beat him 30 years ago, reduced to a stumbling, lost old man in a wrinkled suit. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Derek hissed, looking around nervously to see who was watching. He stood up, trying to physically block me from Vance's view. I put on a blank, empty stare. I told him I was looking for my wife, Vivian. I told him I forgot where we parked the car. Vivian had been dead for 5 years. Playing the dementia card this hard tasted like ash in my mouth, but I knew it would make them completely reckless. Vance leaned back in his luxurious booth and let out a deep, mocking laugh. "Well, Calvin, it is so good to see you," he said, his voice dripping with pure venom. "You are looking absolutely terrible. Time has not been kind to the king of the South Side." Vanessa did not miss a single beat. She stood up, grabbing my arm with a grip tight enough to leave bruises on my skin. Her face was twisted in absolute disgust and elite prejudice. She leaned in close so only the table could hear, but she spoke with a hatred that was completely unrestrained. "You are a pathetic embarrassment," she spat right in my face. "Look at you wandering around like a lost stray dog. We are doing highly important business here with Mr. Vance, and you are ruining it with your senile garbage. You need to go back to the house right now before I call the hospital and have you locked in a padded room where you belong. You are nothing but a burden." I let my shoulders slump forward. I let my eyes water, playing the thoroughly broken and humiliated father. I mumbled a weak apology, letting my chin rest on my chest. As Vanessa pushed me away roughly, I fumbled clumsily with my wooden cane. I let it slip from my hands and it clattered loudly onto the polished hardwood floor right under their table. I bent down slowly, groaning as if my joints were failing me. While my body was completely hidden under the edge of the long table, my right hand moved with the lightning speed of a street hustler. I pulled a magnetic micro-recorder the size of a coin from my sleeve and stuck it directly under the heavy wooden table right beneath Vance's seat. I grabbed my cane, pulled myself up, and kept my head bowed in total defeat. I shuffled away from the table, leaving them to their cruel laughter. I heard Vance tell Derek he could not wait to finally take out the trash, and I heard my son nervously agree with him. They watched me walk out the door, convinced I was completely broken. I walked out of the restaurant, and my driver opened the door to my waiting town car. The moment the heavy car door closed, the fragile old man routine completely vanished. My posture straightened, and my mind was razor sharp. My hands were rock steady. I pulled out my secure receiver and put the earpiece in. The audio from the restaurant was crystal clear. I sat in the dark car and listened as Arthur Vance and my son finalized the illegal sale of my empire. I listened as they openly discussed hiding the $50 million fraud from federal regulators and dividing the kickback money. I heard Vanessa negotiate her cut of the offshore funds. They were so drunk on their own arrogance and my supposed dementia that they spoke about massive federal crimes in a crowded restaurant. They thought they had just publicly humiliated a dying king. They did not know they had just handed me the exact audio evidence I needed to put all 3 of them in a federal penitentiary. The final piece of the puzzle was in my hand, and it was time to prepare the guillotine. I sat in the back of the heavy town car, watching the city lights blur past the tinted windows. Desmond was sitting across from me, his eyes locked on the digital audio file we had just captured. The recording from the steakhouse was an absolute goldmine. We listened to it 3 times in a row just to make sure we did not miss a single treacherous detail. Arthur Vance and my son were openly discussing a massive federal crime. They outlined the exact structure of the offshore kickbacks, the illegal monopoly they were building to shut out minority contractors on the South Side, and the $50 million shadow loan Derek had forged in my name. This was no longer just a tragic story about a greedy, ungrateful child trying to rob his wealthy father. This was a highly organized corporate conspiracy that crossed state lines and involved international wire fraud. I looked at Desmond and told him we were not waiting for the morning. We were taking this straight to the federal authorities right now. The next morning, we walked through the heavy glass doors of the FBI field office in downtown Chicago. I left the wooden cane in the trunk of the car. There was no more playing the fragile, fading old man today. I wore a sharp charcoal suit and walked with the heavy, confident stride of a man who owned half the concrete in this city. Desmond had already pulled some significant strings to bypass the front desk bureaucracy. We were escorted directly into a secure, soundproof conference room deep inside the white-collar crime division. A few minutes later, Special Agent Thomas Miller walked in. Miller was a veteran investigator who specialized in massive corporate fraud and shadow banking syndicates. He was a man who did not care about your social status or your bank account. He only cared about hard evidence. We sat down at the cold steel table. I did not waste his time with emotional family drama. I placed the digital recorder right in the center of the table and pressed play. Miller sat perfectly still with his arms crossed over his chest. He listened to the entire 45-minute conversation. He heard Vanessa spit her racist venom about my heritage. He heard Arthur Vance plotting to gut Sterling Logistics and gentrify the South Side neighborhoods I had spent decades protecting. And he heard my own son explicitly detail how he forged my signature on the emergency medical power of attorney to secure a $50 million illegal loan. He heard Derek promise to hand the entire logistics empire over to Vance for pennies on the dollar the moment he took the title of Chief Executive Officer. When the recording finally ended, the room was completely silent. Miller let out a slow, heavy breath and leaned forward. He looked at me with a deep, undeniable respect. He told me the audio was incredibly compelling and that it painted a perfect picture of their criminal intent. But then his expression hardened and he dropped the cold, brutal reality of the federal justice system right onto the table. He said intent to commit fraud is one thing, but securing a federal indictment that will stick requires an undeniable executed action. He explained that right now, Derek was technically just a vice president running his mouth over an expensive steak dinner. If the FBI raided his house today, his high-priced defense lawyers would tear the case apart. They would argue that Derek was just boasting to a competitor and that he never actually assumed control of the company or the fraudulent debt. They would claim it was all hypothetical business talk. Miller looked me dead in the eye and said they needed the ink to dry on the crime. They needed Derek to formally and legally execute the corporate takeover. They needed him to sign a legally binding document that explicitly transferred all corporate liabilities and debts directly to his name. And he needed to do it while completely sober and in front of unimpeachable witnesses so his lawyers could never claim he was coerced or tricked in private. Without that final signature, the $50 million shadow loan would legally remain my responsibility, and the FBI would not have the jurisdiction to intervene before the shadow bank tore my empire to pieces. Desmond smiled a dark, calculated smile and pulled a thick legal binder from his briefcase. He slid it across the table to Special Agent Miller. Desmond explained that we had already anticipated this exact legal hurdle. He showed Miller the executive transition agreement we had drafted for the upcoming company anniversary gala. He pointed out the specific poison pill clause hidden deep inside the transition documents. The clause stated that by signing the agreement, the new chief executive officer voluntarily assumes full personal and professional liability for all existing corporate debts, including unverified or pending shadow equity loans. Miller read the clause carefully, and his eyes widened in realization. He looked at Desmond and told him it was a brilliant legal death trap. If Derek signs this document, he legally adopts the $50 million fraud as his own doing. He will be putting his own head directly into the federal noose. But Miller warned us that the timing had to be absolutely flawless. The signature had to happen in public, and it had to happen before the shadow bank attempted to collect the funds. I leaned across the steel table and told Miller the timing was already set in stone. The retirement gala was scheduled for this coming Saturday night at the Palmer House Hotel. 300 of the most influential people in Chicago would be there. The mayor, the press, the union leaders, and all of our major investors. I told Miller that I was going to walk up onto the main stage, look my son in the eye, and hand him the transition contract on a silver platter in front of everyone. He is so blinded by his own greed and his desire to publicly humiliate me that he will sign that document without reading a single word. He will claim the throne and the massive debt all at once. Building an empire takes decades of sleepless nights and brutal sacrifices. It takes a level of discipline most people will never understand. I thought about the thousands of families on the South Side whose livelihoods depended on the paychecks I signed. I could not let a spoiled, arrogant boy trade their futures to a predator like Vance just to cover his own gambling debts. Giving Derek the pen to sign his own destruction was the hardest thing I would ever have to do as a father, but it was the only way to save the legacy I had built as a man. Miller agreed to the operation. He said the FBI would deploy a dozen undercover agents to the gala. They would be dressed as catering staff, security guards, and audio technicians. They would have the perimeter completely secured, and they would wait for my direct signal. Once Derek signed the paper and the transfer was legally complete, the federal agents would move in and shut the entire room down. We shook hands, and I walked out of the federal building with Desmond by my side. The cold Chicago wind whipped through the city streets, but I felt a burning fire in my chest. The trap was fully constructed, and the federal government was standing right behind me, ready to pull the lever. But a heavy realization settled over my shoulders as we drove back to the estate. To make this work, I had to walk a dangerous psychological tightrope. I had to go back to my house and continue living under the same roof as the people trying to destroy me. I had to look at Vanessa knowing she had tried to drug me. I had to look at Derek knowing he had sold my legacy to my worst enemy. I had to let them push me around and treat me like garbage for just a few more days. I had to swallow my pride and play the broken, defeated old man all the way up to the very last second. Because if I showed even a fraction of my true strength before Saturday night, they would panic and run with the stolen money. The greatest test of my life was not building a $300 million empire from the dirt. It was maintaining absolute silence while my enemies dug their own graves right in front of me. The final act was approaching, and I was ready to bring the curtain down. The morning of the company anniversary gala finally arrived. The sky over Chicago was a heavy, flat gray, threatening snow. I was sitting in my bedroom staring out the window at the sprawling grounds of my estate. My hands were resting on my lap, completely steady. For weeks I had been playing the role of a fading, senile old man. I had swallowed my pride. I had let my own son and his toxic wife parade around my house like they had already buried me. Today was the day the masquerade would end. But before I could put the final nail in their coffins, Vanessa decided she needed to twist the knife one last time. The heavy oak door to my bedroom swung open without a single knock. Vanessa marched in. She did not even pretend to show an ounce of respect. She was holding a plastic dry cleaning bag in one hand and a few folded sheets of paper in the other. She wore a smug, deeply satisfied smile that made my blood run cold. She looked around my private sanctuary with absolute disgust, as if she was already measuring the room for her own expensive furniture. She walked right up to me and tossed the plastic bag onto my bed. It landed with a cheap crinkling sound. I looked down at it. It was a suit, but it was not one of my custom Italian wool suits. It was a cheap, off-the-rack polyester nightmare, the kind of suit you buy at a discount department store for $50. It was a deliberate insult cut from cheap fabric. "Put that on tonight, Calvin," she commanded, her voice completely dropping the fake sweet tone she used when other people were around. "You are not wearing your expensive tailored suits anymore. People need to see a tired, weak old man who is ready to step down. If you look too sharp, the investors might wonder why you are retiring. You need to look like the past. Derek is the future." I kept my eyes lowered. I let my hands shake slightly, resting them on my knees. I asked her what she wanted from me tonight, playing the part of the confused and defeated father. She tossed the folded sheets of paper right onto my lap. They landed next to my trembling hands. "This is your speech," she said, crossing her arms over her chest. "You are going to walk up onto that stage. You are going to read exactly what is written on those pages word for word. You are going to tell the mayor, the press, and the board of directors that your mind is failing. You are going to praise Derek as the brilliant visionary who saved the company. And then you are going to publicly sign the executive transition agreement, handing him absolute control of Sterling Logistics." I looked at the script. It was a masterclass in public humiliation. It was designed to completely erase my 40 years of hard work and hand all the credit to a boy who had never built a single thing in his entire life. I looked up at Vanessa and let a sliver of hesitation into my voice. I told her I built the company from the dirt of the South Side. I told her I wanted to say a few words of my own to thank the people who stood by me. Vanessa stepped closer to my chair. The scent of her expensive perfume was suffocating. She leaned down until her face was just inches from mine. The sheer malice in her eyes was astonishing. "You will not say a single word that is not on that paper," she whispered, her voice dripping with pure venom. "You are done, Calvin. Your era of dragging ghetto trash into the corporate boardroom is over. Tonight you hand over the keys, and tomorrow morning you are going into the Shady Pines assisted living facility. We already paid the deposit. You will have a small room, a nice nurse to change your adult diapers, and you will never interfere with our business again." I let out a weak, shaky breath. I asked her what would happen if I refused. I asked her what would happen if I went on that stage and told the truth about how they were pushing me out. Vanessa let out a cold, calculated laugh. She stood up straight and looked down at me like I was a dying insect. She had prepared for this exact moment. She told me that if I deviated from her script by even one single syllable, she would absolutely destroy my reputation before the night was over. She smiled and said, "If you try to be a hero tonight, Calvin, I will personally go to the press and tell them you are being forced out because of gross sexual misconduct. I will tell them you have been harassing your young female assistants for years. I will tell them that poor girl Maya from the basement was fired because she rejected your disgusting advances. I will hire women to corroborate the story. I will paint you as a predatory monster who used his power to abuse women of color. By the time I am done with you, your legacy will be nothing but a dirty punchline. Your community will spit on your name, and the city will strip your name off every building you ever funded." The silence in the bedroom was heavy and absolute. I sat there looking at the woman my son had chosen to marry. She was standing in the house my money paid for, threatening to destroy the name I had spent my entire life building. She was a white woman standing in the sanctuary of a black man who had fought tooth and nail against a rigged system to build an empire, and she was casually threatening to weaponize that same system against me with fake accusations. She was willing to falsely accuse me of predatory crimes just to secure her own unearned wealth. She had absolutely no moral compass, no boundaries, and no soul. Any lingering trace of paternal mercy I had left in my heart died right then and there. For weeks, a small part of me had wondered if destroying my son and his wife was too harsh. I had laid awake at night staring at the ceiling, wondering if I should just fire Derek, cut him out of the will, and banish them from my life. I wondered if the federal prison sentence was too brutal for my own flesh and blood. I thought about the days when Derek was a little boy running around the construction sites in a yellow hard hat, looking up at me like I was a superhero. But looking at Vanessa as she proudly weaponized lies to destroy my honor, looking at the arrogance that my son had enabled and encouraged, I realized that a poison this deep had to be burned out completely. You cannot put a Band-Aid on a tumor. You have to cut it out. I looked down at the cheap polyester suit lying on my bed. I reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the plastic cover back. I let my breathing become shallow and erratic. I looked up at Vanessa and I smiled. It was not a smile of defeat. It was a weak, fragile smile of a broken old man surrendering to his captors. "I understand, Vanessa," I said, my voice soft and defeated. "I will wear the suit. I will read the script. I will sign the papers. You and Derek have won. Just please do not hurt my name." Vanessa smirked, completely satisfied with her brutal victory. She looked at me with absolute contempt, as if my surrender was the most pathetic thing she had ever witnessed. She turned around and walked toward the door without another word, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She thought she had just broken the great Calvin Sterling. She thought she had cornered the lion and pulled its teeth. As the door clicked shut behind her, the trembling in my hands instantly stopped. My posture straightened. The fragile old man vanished, leaving only the cold, calculating architect of their impending destruction. I stood up from my chair and walked over to the bed. I picked up the cheap polyester suit and examined the terrible stitching and the rough fabric. It was exactly what a man who had lost everything would wear. It was perfect. It was the ultimate camouflage. I walked over to my closet and pulled out a hidden secure lockbox from the very back shelf. Inside was a custom-tailored silk-lined tuxedo vest. Woven directly into the inner lining was a state-of-the-art micro-recording wire provided directly by Special Agent Miller at the FBI. The device was completely undetectable to scanners and physical pat-downs. I would wear the cheap suit just like she demanded, but underneath it I would be wearing the ultimate federal wiretap, broadcasting every single word directly to the agents waiting in the hotel lobby. Vanessa wanted me to read her script. She wanted me to publicly surrender my company. She wanted me to be humiliated in front of 300 of the most powerful people in Chicago. I was going to give her exactly what she wanted. I was going to walk onto that stage and play my part flawlessly. I would let Derek sign the transition agreement and publicly claim the throne along with the massive $50 million shadow debt that came with it. I would let them stand at the very top of the mountain, and then I was going to push them off. I laid the cheap suit out on my bed and carefully placed her written speech next to it. I did not feel sad. I did not feel angry. I felt an absolute freezing calm, the kind of calm that comes right before a devastating storm hits the shoreline. They had dug their own graves. They had built their own gallows. All I had to do tonight was hand them the rope. The gala was only 10 hours away, and hell was coming with me. The grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hotel was a sea of crystal chandeliers and blinding wealth. 300 of the most powerful people in Chicago were gathered in one room. There were prominent politicians, wealthy real estate moguls, federal judges, and the city mayor, all drinking expensive champagne paid for by the company I built from nothing. I walked through the heavy gilded doors wearing the cheap off-the-rack polyester suit Vanessa had thrown at me that morning. The fabric scratched roughly against my skin, but I did not care. Deep underneath the terrible tailoring tucked safely inside the lining of my silk vest was the federal wiretap provided by Special Agent Miller. It was broadcasting every single sound directly to a surveillance van parked in the alleyway outside. I shuffled my feet deliberately, dragging my heavy wooden cane across the polished marble floor. I rounded my shoulders and kept my head bowed, playing the part of the broken, defeated old man to absolute perfection. The whispers rippled through the elegant crowd the second I entered the room. I could hear the hushed pity in their voices. They looked at the great Calvin Sterling, the untouchable titan of the South Side, and saw nothing but a crumbling fossil ready to be buried. I found my assigned seat at the front table. It was supposed to be the seat of honor, but Derek had placed me at the very edge, almost completely out of the spotlight. I slowly sat down and looked across the room. I saw Vanessa instantly. She was wearing a custom-designed diamond-encrusted gown that must have cost at least $20,000. She was holding a crystal flute of champagne, laughing loudly with the wives of the city council members. She looked like a highly arrogant queen who had just successfully poisoned the reigning king. She glanced over at me, and a vicious, satisfied smirk crossed her face. She thought her brutal threats from this morning had completely broken my spirit. She truly believed the cheap suit I was wearing was my ultimate white flag of surrender. Sitting just 2 tables away was Arthur Vance. My oldest and most hated enemy was sipping a dark bourbon, looking incredibly smug. He gave me a slow, mocking nod from across the room. He was waiting patiently for his foolish puppet Derek to take the throne so he could buy my entire legacy for pennies on the dollar. He thought he was witnessing my final humiliating defeat. I lowered my eyes and let my hands shake, resting them on the table, but inside my chest my heart was beating with the cold, steady rhythm of an executioner. The lights in the grand ballroom suddenly dimmed, and a single bright spotlight illuminated the main stage. The ambient noise of the crowd fell completely silent as Derek walked up the steps. He looked like $1 million in his bespoke tailored tuxedo. He stood behind the heavy mahogany podium looking out over the sea of wealthy investors with pure, unearned arrogance. He grabbed the microphone and smiled a bright, blinding smile. He did not start his speech by honoring the history of Sterling Logistics. He did not start by thanking the hard-working men and women who drove our heavy trucks in the freezing snow and managed our warehouses in the blistering heat. He started by talking entirely about himself. He told the crowd that the global business world was evolving rapidly, and that companies trapped in the past were absolutely destined to die. He spoke about aggressive modernization, corporate restructuring, and maximizing offshore shareholder value. And then he turned his sights directly on me. He looked down at my table and his voice dripped with a sickening mixture of fake sympathy and real poison. He told the entire ballroom that building a company from the slums of the South Side was a noble story, but that noble stories do not survive in the modern economy. He said his father was a man of a different era, a man who relied on outdated street tactics and a stubborn, foolish loyalty to unprofitable urban neighborhoods. He called my methods completely obsolete. He called my vision narrow and archaic. He told the mayor and the investors that the company was bleeding its true potential because it was being run by a man whose mind and body were failing fast. He said it was finally time to clean house and elevate the Sterling brand far away from its gritty, low-class origins. The sheer disrespect was staggering. He was verbally humiliating me in front of the city I had spent 40 years helping to build. I could hear a few uncomfortable murmurs in the crowd, but most of the wealthy investors simply nodded in agreement, blinded by his promises of higher profit margins. Vanessa was clapping softly in the front row, her eyes shining with pure toxic delight. Arthur Vance was grinning so widely he looked like a predator staring at a wounded animal. Then Derek pulled a thick leather-bound folder from inside his tuxedo jacket. It was the executive transition document. The exact document Desmond and I had carefully prepared. The legal poison pill. He placed it flat on the mahogany podium and uncapped his heavy gold fountain pen. He leaned into the microphone and his voice echoed loudly through the silent ballroom. He said, "Tonight we turn the page. Tonight I am officially assuming the title of Chief Executive Officer and taking full personal and professional responsibility for the entire future of Sterling Logistics." He looked down at the document and without hesitating for a single second, he signed his name on the bottom line. My breath caught in my throat. He did it. He had just legally bound himself to the company and every single liability attached to it. By signing that specific piece of paper, he had just formally adopted the $50 million fraudulent shadow loan as his own personal debt. The ink was finally dry on his destruction. But Derek was not finished. He wanted his moment of absolute dominance. He looked right at me and pointed his finger toward the stage. He called my name into the microphone. He told me to come up to the stage and do the right thing for once in my old age. He told me to come up and officially countersign the documents to surrender my empire to a better man. I gripped my wooden cane and slowly pushed myself up from the table. I made a great show of struggling to find my balance. I kept my head down and began the long, slow walk up the center aisle toward the stage. The silence in the room was suffocating. Every eye was locked on my cheap, wrinkled suit and my trembling hands. I walked up the 3 short steps to the stage, letting my cane tap loudly against the wood. I stopped right in front of the podium. Derek was standing there holding out the gold pen to me. His eyes were wide with pure manic triumph. He leaned in extremely close so the microphone would catch his voice. He wanted the entire room to hear his final victory. He looked at me with absolute disgust and whispered harshly into the microphone, "You are washed up, old man. The empire is mine now. Sign the paper and get out of my sight." I looked down at the gold pen in his hand. I looked out at Vanessa, who was practically vibrating with joy. I looked at Arthur Vance, who was raising his glass to me. I took a slow, deep breath. The fragile old man routine was over. The masquerade was officially dead. I straightened my spine. I stood up to my full height, towering over my arrogant son. I dropped the wooden cane and it clattered loudly onto the stage floor. I reached out and instead of taking the pen, I grabbed the microphone directly from the podium. I dropped the wooden cane and it clattered loudly onto the polished stage floor. The sound echoed through the grand ballroom, cutting through the thick silence like a gunshot. I did not bend down to pick it up. I did not need it. I never needed it. I stood up to my full height, squaring my shoulders and looking down at the son who thought he had just buried me alive. Derek was still holding the heavy gold pen out toward me, his hand trembling slightly, not with fear but with pure, unchecked adrenaline. He had just signed his name on the bottom line of the executive transition agreement. He had pressed the ink deep into the thick parchment paper, legally binding himself to every single asset and every single liability of Sterling Logistics. He thought he was signing the deed to a $300 million kingdom. He had absolutely no idea that Desmond and I had surgically gutted the entire company 48 hours ago. He had no idea that the document he just proudly signed made him the sole legal guarantor of a $50 million fraudulent shadow loan. He pulled the pen back and leaned in close to me. He was so incredibly arrogant, so desperate for his moment of absolute dominance that he leaned right into the main microphone on the mahogany podium. He wanted the 300 powerful people in the room to hear his victory. He wanted to humiliate me in front of the mayor, the investors, and the press. He looked at my cheap polyester suit and his lip curled into a disgusting sneer. "You are washed up, old man," he snarled, his voice booming through the massive speakers suspended above us. "The empire is mine now. Sign the paper and get out of my sight." A collective gasp rippled through the sea of crystal chandeliers and expensive evening gowns. The wealthy elite of Chicago sat completely frozen in their velvet chairs. I looked out into the crowd. I saw Vanessa sitting in the front row, her eyes wide with toxic delight, her diamond necklace sparkling under the stage lights. She was practically vibrating with joy, thinking her master plan had worked flawlessly. 2 tables away, Preston Vance was swirling his dark bourbon, a smug, predatory grin plastered across his wrinkled face. He was already calculating how he would carve up my Southside territories by Monday morning. I turned my attention back to Derek. He was breathing heavily, his chest puffing out, his bespoke tuxedo jacket tailored perfectly to his frame. He thought he was a king. But a king knows how to build a castle. Derek only knew how to steal the keys. I reached out my hand. I did not take the gold pen. I did not reach for the transition document. I reached past him and took the microphone directly from the wooden stand. I gripped the cold metal in my right hand, feeling the weight of 40 years of hard work, 40 years of bleeding for my community, resting right in my palm. I looked Derek dead in the eye. I did not blink. I let the fake, fragile persona melt away entirely. The dull, confused look in my eyes sharpened into a cold, calculating stare. My face hardened into the exact same expression I used when I negotiated brutal contract disputes with union bosses and corrupt politicians 3 decades ago. Derek saw the shift instantly. The arrogant smirk on his face faltered. His eyes darted to my hands, noticing they were completely steady. He looked at my posture, noticing my spine was straight as a steel beam. For the very first time in his pampered, entitled life, he realized he was standing on a stage with a predator. I lifted the microphone to my mouth. The ballroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop on the marble floor. I let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds, letting the tension wrap around his throat like a wire. Then I smiled a dark, freezing smile, and I spoke 6 words that destroyed his entire life. You just inherited a federal indictment. My voice did not shake. It resonated through the massive speakers, deep and unyielding, hitting the back walls of the ballroom like a physical wave. Derek stared at me, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly. The color drained from his face at a terrifying speed, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping into the heavy mahogany podium. "What did you just say?" he whispered, his voice cracking. I stepped forward, invading his space, projecting my voice clearly into the microphone so every single person in the room could hear exactly what kind of coward he was. I said, "You are done, Derek." I told him the company he just legally claimed the company he just signed for is completely bankrupt. I told him he just signed his name to a hollow shell carrying a $50 million fraudulent loan from a shadow banking syndicate. I told him the money he stole to buy his mistress a penthouse and his wife a luxury yacht was completely gone, and the debt was now entirely his problem. In the front row, Vanessa stood up abruptly, knocking her crystal champagne flute onto the floor. It shattered into a dozen pieces. Her face was twisted in absolute terror. She realized the trap had just sprung. She looked at the cheap suit I was wearing and finally understood it was not a white flag of surrender. It was a hunting uniform. Preston Vance stopped smiling. His glass of bourbon froze halfway to his mouth. The seasoned corporate shark realized he had just been outplayed by the very man he thought was rotting away with dementia. Derek started shaking violently. His perfectly tailored tuxedo suddenly looked like a straitjacket. "You are lying," he stammered, clutching the edge of the podium to keep himself from collapsing. "You are crazy. Your mind is gone. You do not know what you are talking about." I reached into the inner pocket of my cheap polyester jacket. I pulled out a small black remote control. I held it up for him to see. "My mind has never been sharper, son," I said coldly. "I know about the forged medical power of attorney. I know about the fake will Vanessa stole from my biometric safe at 2 a.m. I know about the backdoor deal you made with Preston Vance to sell out our community for a $5 million offshore kickback." Derek looked like he was going to vomit. His eyes darted frantically around the ballroom, looking for an exit, looking for a way to escape the blazing spotlight he had demanded for himself. "And the best part, Derek," I continued, my voice echoing with pure, calculated vengeance. I did not even have to hire a private investigator to prove it. "You confessed to all of it right under my roof. You bragged about federal wire fraud while drinking my expensive scotch. And you did it while I was listening to every single word." I pressed the button on the small black remote. I had arranged this specific detail with the hotel audio technicians who were actually undercover agents. The main projection screen behind us suddenly dropped down from the ceiling. A bright projector flashed to life, illuminating the dark stage. The screen displayed a massive high-resolution image of the fraudulent $50 million shadow loan contract, highlighting the forged signature Derek had placed at the bottom. But the visual was not the execution. The audio was. The ballroom speakers suddenly blasted the crystal-clear audio recording I had captured from the steakhouse. It was Derek's own voice echoing through the Grand Hotel, boasting about forging my signature, bleeding the company dry, and handing the South Side over to Preston Vance. It was followed by Vanessa's voice spitting racist venom about my heritage and plotting to lock me in a psychiatric ward. The entire crowd erupted in absolute shock. The mayor covered his mouth in horror. The investors began shouting in outrage. Preston Vance stood up, trying to discreetly move toward the back exit, his face pale with the realization that he was caught on tape negotiating an illegal monopoly. Derek fell to his knees on the stage. He grabbed his hair, crying hysterically, begging me to turn the audio off. He sounded exactly like a terrified child. But I felt absolutely no pity. You cannot cure a cancer with a bandage. I looked down at the boy I had raised. He wanted to steal my crown. He wanted to humiliate me. He wanted to throw me away like garbage. I had given him the world, and he tried to sell it to my enemies. I tapped the microphone one last time, cutting through the chaotic shouting of the ballroom. "I told you I was going to retire tonight," I said, my voice slicing through the noise. "But I never said I was giving you the keys to my kingdom. I gave you a shovel, and you just finished digging your own grave." The echo of my final words hung in the grand ballroom like a physical weight. I gave you a shovel, and you just finished digging your own grave. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. 300 of the most powerful people in Chicago were completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal they had just witnessed. Derek was still on his knees, gasping for air, his bespoke tuxedo looking like a crumpled rag. Then the heavy oak doors at the back of the Palmer House ballroom burst open with a deafening crash. A dozen men and women wearing dark tactical jackets with the letters FBI emblazoned in bold yellow across their backs flooded into the room. They moved with absolute military precision, spreading out to secure every single exit. Special Agent Thomas Miller walked straight down the center aisle, his badge held high in the air. His face was a mask of pure federal authority. He commanded everyone to remain exactly where they were. He announced that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was executing multiple arrest warrants for corporate fraud, conspiracy, and wire fraud. The elite crowd completely lost their minds. Politicians who had been drinking our champagne just moments ago practically fell over themselves trying to back away from the stage. Wealthy socialites dropped their crystal glasses, shattering them on the marble floor. I looked over at Arthur Vance. The seasoned corporate predator had quietly slipped out of his chair and was attempting to slide toward the kitchen service doors. He did not make it 5 feet. 2 massive federal agents blocked his path, placing a heavy hand on his expensive suit jacket and ordering him back to his table. The look of absolute terror on Vance's face was worth every single second of the fragile act I had to play. But I was not quite finished with my own flesh and blood. Arresting Derek was the legal solution. But I needed to completely dismantle the toxic social foundation they had built. I needed to ensure that Vanessa could never show her face in this city ever again. I looked over at the audio mixing booth where my undercover agents were stationed. I gave them a slow, deliberate nod. The massive projection screen behind me flickered. The image of the forged $50 million loan disappeared and was instantly replaced by a series of high-resolution bank statements. The documents were magnified so large that even the people in the very back row could read every single line item. The screen displayed the exact wire transfers Derek had made from the Sterling Logistics operating accounts. It showed the $2.5 million transfer for a custom luxury yacht registered in Vanessa's name. It showed the monthly lease payments for a downtown penthouse registered to a 24-year-old woman who was absolutely not his wife. I heard the collective gasp from the crowd. People began to point and whisper loudly. I looked down at Vanessa. The smug, arrogant queen of the front row was completely falling apart. Her face turned beet red as the entire ballroom realized her lavish lifestyle was funded entirely by stolen money and that her husband was keeping a mistress on the company dime. But the final blow was not visual. It was audio. The speakers crackled and Vanessa's own voice blasted through the ballroom. It was the recording from my home study the night she broke into my safe. Her voice echoed off the crystal chandeliers, dripping with toxic elite arrogance and vile racism. She was complaining about the South Side origins of my company. She called my life work ghetto trash. She said she was physically sick of being associated with hood projects and urban charity. She mocked the color of my skin and the very soil her husband's family came from. She laughed as she told Derek they needed to wash the Sterling name clean of its street-level origins and lock me away in a psychiatric ward so they could finally elevate the brand away from the slums. The reaction in the ballroom was instantaneous and explosive. There were prominent black community leaders, city council members, and minority investors sitting at those tables. People who had bled for this city. People who knew exactly what it took to build something from nothing. They stood up from their chairs shouting in pure outrage. The mayor who had praised Derek just an hour ago looked at Vanessa with absolute disgust. The wealthy elite wives who had been laughing with her moments before physically backed away, leaving her completely isolated in the front row. Vanessa snapped. The pristine, flawless image she had spent years cultivating was completely obliterated in less than 60 seconds. She realized she was not just going to lose her money. She was going to be a social pariah, a completely hated figure in the entire city of Chicago. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream and scrambled up the short steps onto the stage. She did not run to comfort her husband. She ran at him with pure violence. She stood over Derek, who was still kneeling on the floor, and began screaming at the top of her lungs. She called him a pathetic idiot. She blamed him for everything. She screamed that he was too stupid to execute a simple plan and that he had ruined her entire life. Derek looked up at her, his face covered in tears, and tried to grab her hands. He begged her to stop, to calm down and remember that they were in this together. Vanessa did not calm down. She raised her hand and slapped Derek viciously across the face. The smack echoed through the microphone still resting on the podium. She hit him again, calling him a failure and a coward. She screamed that she never should have married into such a pathetic family. She was completely unraveling, showing every single person in that room the ugly, toxic monster she truly was. Special Agent Miller did not give them time to continue their public domestic dispute. He stepped onto the stage, followed by 3 federal agents holding heavy steel handcuffs. He read them their Miranda rights in a loud, clear voice that cut right through Vanessa's hysterical screaming. Derek did not fight back. He went completely limp, sobbing openly as the agents pulled his arms behind his back and locked the cold steel cuffs around his wrists. The boy who had stood on that exact spot 10 minutes earlier declaring himself a king was now nothing but a broken, crying criminal being hauled away in front of the people he tried to impress. Vanessa fought like a cornered wild animal. She thrashed and kicked, screaming that she was a victim and that she had no idea what her husband was doing. She demanded they let her go, threatening to sue the FBI and destroy their careers. It took 2 federal agents to physically restrain her. They locked the handcuffs securely over her wrists, pinning her arms behind her back. I stood perfectly still on the stage and watched the agents drag them away. Vanessa stumbled, her $20,000 custom diamond gown catching on her heels and dragging across the dirty stage floor. Her perfect hair was a tangled mess, and her makeup was running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She looked back at me over her shoulder, her eyes filled with a terrifying mixture of hatred and absolute panic. Derek could not even look at me. He kept his head bowed, his shoulders shaking with loud, pathetic sobs as the agents marched him down the center aisle. The crowd of wealthy investors and politicians parted for them like the Red Sea, completely silent, watching the absolute destruction of a greedy son who tried to bury his own father. Agent Miller walked over to the podium and confiscated the executive transition document. The paper Derek had so proudly signed was now the primary piece of physical evidence for a massive federal indictment. Miller looked at me and gave a short, respectful nod before turning to coordinate the rest of the raid. The ballroom was in complete chaos. Federal agents were actively seizing laptops from the administrative tables, sealing documents, and interviewing the panicked investors. Arthur Vance was sitting at his table, surrounded by 3 agents, looking like a man who knew his entire corrupt empire was about to be audited into oblivion. I stood alone on the stage, looking out over the flashing blue and red police lights reflecting off the grand windows of the Palmer House Hotel. I had built Sterling Logistics to provide a future for my family. I had given Derek every single advantage I never had, and he chose to weaponize my love to destroy me. I felt a heavy, tired weight settle deep into my bones, but my mind remained absolutely clear. The public execution was over. The trap had worked flawlessly, but the war was not completely finished. They were going to process Derek down at the federal holding facility tonight. He was going to sit in a cold concrete cell and realize that his life was completely over. And tomorrow morning I was going to walk right into that interrogation room and look him in the eye one last time. He wanted to play the game of kings, and I was going to make sure he understood exactly what it cost to lose. The morning sun had not yet risen over Chicago when my town car pulled up to the Federal Detention Center. The building was a massive block of gray concrete and reinforced steel sitting right on the edge of the city. It looked exactly like what it was, A cold, unforgiving cage designed to break the spirits of the people locked inside. I stepped out of the car wearing my heavy charcoal wool overcoat. The freezing wind bit at my face, but I did not feel the cold. My mind was completely numb to the weather. Desmond walked silently beside me, carrying his thick leather briefcase. We did not speak. There was nothing left to say. The legal execution had been carried out flawlessly the night before, and now I was here to view the remains. Special Agent Miller met us at the heavily guarded front entrance. He nodded respectfully and led me through a maze of metal detectors, thick plexiglass doors, and sterile white hallways. The air inside smelled of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner. Miller stopped in front of a heavy steel door with a small reinforced window. He told me my son had been crying non-stop since they booked him at midnight. He said Derek had waived his right to an attorney during the initial processing because he was absolutely convinced I was coming down here to bail him out. He thought the great Calvin Sterling would never let his own flesh and blood rot in a federal holding cell. He was about to learn his final lesson. Miller unlocked the heavy door and stepped aside, letting me enter the small interrogation room alone. The room was freezing. There was a single metal table bolted directly to the concrete floor and 2 uncomfortable steel chairs. Sitting in one of those chairs was the boy I had raised. Derek was wearing a bright orange institutional jumpsuit that was slightly too big for him. His wrists were locked in heavy steel handcuffs chained to a thick metal ring attached to the table. His expensive bespoke tuxedo, his gold fountain pen, his arrogance, and his smug superiority were completely gone. He looked up when the door clicked shut behind me. His face was a bruised, puffy mess of smeared tears and pure, absolute terror. The second he saw me, he completely broke down. He let out a loud, pathetic wail that echoed off the concrete walls. He tried to stand up, but the heavy chain pulled him right back down to the metal chair. He slid off the chair and fell hard onto his knees, hitting the cold floor. He looked up at me with desperate, swollen eyes and began begging. He cried out my name. He called me Dad over and over again, his voice cracking and breaking with every single syllable. He begged me to get him out of there. He said he was sorry. He said he made a terrible mistake and that he was just stressed and confused. He blamed Vanessa. He blamed Arthur Vance. He blamed the shadow banking syndicate. He said they manipulated him and pressured him into signing the documents. He begged me to pay the bail. He said I had the money and the power to make this all go away. He promised he would go to a rehabilitation center for his gambling addiction. He promised he would leave Vanessa and never speak to her again. He promised he would spend the rest of his life making it up to me. I stood perfectly still just inside the doorway, looking down at the weeping creature on the floor. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the protective instinct of a father. That part of my soul had died the moment I heard him laughing about locking me in a psychiatric ward so he could steal my legacy. I told him to get off the floor. My voice was incredibly low and completely devoid of any emotion. It was the voice of a judge reading a final sentence. I told him he was embarrassing himself. Derek slowly pulled himself back up into the steel chair, sniffing loudly and wiping his nose against the rough orange fabric of his sleeve. He looked at me with a tiny shred of foolish hope. He thought my calm demeanor meant I was there to save him. He thought the scolding was the worst part, and that the checkbook was coming out next. I walked over to the metal table and unbuttoned my wool overcoat. I reached into my inner pocket and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. It was not a bail bond. It was the final certified corporate restructuring agreement Desmond and I had executed in the dark. I placed it flat on the cold steel table right in front of his handcuffed wrists. I looked him dead in the eye and told him to listen to me very carefully because I was only going to explain this one time. I told him he was not getting out on bail. I told him the federal prosecutor was denying bail based on his massive offshore flight risk and the sheer scale of the $50 million international wire fraud. But I told him the criminal charges were actually the least of his problems. I pointed to the document on the table. I explained that 48 hours before the gala, Desmond and I completely gutted Sterling Logistics. I told him we surgically removed every single valuable asset the company owned. The warehouse deeds, the fleet of 3,000 trucks, the government supply chain contracts, and the technology patents. I told him we legally transferred all of it into an anonymous protected shell company that he had absolutely no access to. Derek's eyes went wide with confusion. He stared at the legal document and shook his head, trying to process the magnitude of what I was saying. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the metal table. I told him that when he proudly signed that executive transition agreement on the stage last night, he did not inherit a $300 million empire. He inherited an empty, hollow shell. He inherited a company that owned 0 buildings, 0 trucks, and 0 capital. I told him the only thing that company possessed was the fraudulent $50 million shadow loan he had personally forged in my name. And because he signed that transition agreement publicly, voluntarily, and completely sober, he formally adopted that entire massive debt directly onto his own shoulders. I watched the realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. His jaw trembled uncontrollably. He realized he was not just facing federal prison. He was facing the shadow banking syndicate. The dangerous men he owed $50 million to would soon realize the company he used as collateral was completely worthless. They would know he scammed them, and they would hunt him to the ends of the earth if he ever stepped out of federal custody. He started hyperventilating. He gasped for air, pulling desperately at his handcuffs. He looked at me with absolute sheer panic and told me I could not do this to him. He said I was sentencing him to death. He said he was my son, and I was supposed to protect him. I stood up straight and looked down at him with an absolute freezing calm. I told him I spent 40 years bleeding into the concrete of the South Side to build an empire so he would never have to know what it felt like to be poor. I gave him the best education, the finest clothes, and a seat at the highest table. And he took all of my sacrifices and tried to sell them to my worst enemy just to cover his own pathetic gambling debts. He tried to drug me and lock me in a cage because he was too lazy to build his own life. I looked him right in his swollen, terrified eyes. I built this empire from the dirt. I said, my voice steady and completely unyielding. You sold it because you are a coward. You wanted to play the game of kings, but you have the heart of a thief. I turned around and walked toward the heavy steel door. Derek started screaming my name, throwing his weight against the table. The metal chains rattled violently. He begged me to come back. He pleaded for mercy. I stopped at the door and looked back over my shoulder one last time. I told him that the federal prison system would be the only protection he had left from the men he owed money to. I told him to stay in this concrete cell and learn how to be a man. I knocked twice on the reinforced window. Special Agent Miller opened the door immediately. I walked out into the sterile white hallway and let the heavy steel door slam shut behind me, completely cutting off the sound of my son's desperate screaming. I walked down the corridor with Desmond, my spine perfectly straight. I did not shed a single tear. The boy I loved died a long time ago. The criminal left in that room was no longer my concern. My empire was completely safe, and it was time to clean up the rest of the garbage he left behind. The afternoon sun offered absolutely no warmth as it hit the massive stone pillars of my Chicago estate. I was standing in the grand foyer with my hands clasped firmly behind my back. Desmond was standing right beside me, holding a thick stack of court-ordered foreclosure documents. We were waiting for a very specific rat to return to the sinking ship. I knew Vanessa would not stay in that federal holding cell for long. Her parents were wealthy enough to post her bail. They were the kind of people who thought money could scrub away any stain. But they were about to find out that their country club money meant absolutely nothing in a war of empires. I knew exactly what Vanessa would do the moment she stepped out of that federal building. A woman driven entirely by greed does not run to her family for comfort. She runs to her closet. She would come straight back to my house to empty her personal safe to pack her $1,000,000 jewelry collection, her designer bags, and the stacks of emergency cash she kept hidden under her floorboards. She wanted to grab her loot and disappear before the federal asset freeze fully locked her out. I looked at the security monitors mounted on the wall. A cheap, battered taxi pulled up to the towering wrought iron gates of my estate. Vanessa stepped out. She was still wearing the same diamond-encrusted designer gown from the gala the night before, but it was no longer a symbol of elite superiority. The fabric was torn at the hem, stained with dirt and the wrinkles of a jail cell. Her hair was a wild, tangled mess, and her expensive makeup was completely washed away, leaving her looking pale and desperate. She marched up to the security keypad and swiped her digital access card. The light blinked an angry red. She swiped it again, faster and harder. Red again. She frantically punched in her master passcode, hitting the buttons with trembling fingers. The system denied her completely. She screamed something at the security camera and kicked the heavy iron gate with her expensive heel. I had instructed my security team to leave the small pedestrian side gate unlocked. I wanted her to make the long, humiliating walk up the massive, winding driveway. I watched on the monitors as she pushed the heavy iron side gate open and began the quarter-mile trek up to the main house. The freezing Chicago wind whipped right through her torn dress, but she kept marching, driven by the sheer panic of losing her physical wealth. When she finally reached the top of the marble steps, she was gasping for air. She pulled a set of brass keys from her small clutch and jammed the deadbolt key into the front door. She tried to turn it, but the internal mechanism was completely different. I had every single lock on the estate changed at 6 in the morning. She rattled the heavy door handle violently. She started pounding her fists against the solid mahogany wood, screaming for my household staff to open the door. I gave Desmond a slow nod. I reached out and pulled the heavy door open. Vanessa practically fell into the foyer, losing her balance for a second before catching herself. She looked up and saw me standing there. The pure, blinding hatred in her eyes was astonishing. She tried to push past me, heading straight for the grand staircase. "Get out of my way, Calvin," she hissed, her voice completely hoarse from screaming in a holding cell all night. "My parents paid my bail and my lawyers are already drafting my divorce papers. I am leaving Derek to rot in that cage you put him in. I am just here to pack my things, and then I am never looking at your pathetic face ever again." I did not move a single inch. I stood perfectly still, blocking the base of the grand staircase like a solid brick wall. "You are not packing anything, Vanessa," I said, my voice low and incredibly calm. "You are turning around and walking right back down that driveway." She let out a bitter, mocking laugh. She crossed her arms over her chest, trying to summon the elite arrogance she had wielded so proudly just 24 hours ago. "You cannot keep me out of my own house," she spat. "Half of everything in this estate belongs to Derek, and by marriage it belongs to me. I know my legal rights. I am going upstairs to my bedroom and taking my jewelry and my clothes. If you try to stop me, I will call the police and have you arrested for theft." Desmond stepped forward from the shadows of the foyer. He did not smile. He simply held up the thick stack of legal documents. "You do not have a bedroom, Mrs. Sterling," Desmond said, his voice cutting through the freezing air like a surgical scalpel. "And you do not have any legal rights to a single item inside this property." Vanessa stared at the papers, her face contorting in confusion. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. I stepped forward, forcing her to take a step back toward the open front door. I told her to listen very carefully because I was only going to explain the reality of her miserable situation one time. I reminded her about the executive transition agreement her foolish husband signed on the stage last night. I reminded her that Derek formally and legally assumed the $50 million fraudulent shadow loan when he took control of the hollowed-out company. I told her that the moment the shadow banking syndicate realized the company was completely bankrupt, they instantly triggered the default clause on the loan. Vanessa's eyes widened in pure terror. She was greedy, but she was not stupid. She knew exactly what a default clause meant. When Derek defaulted on $50 million, the creditors immediately seized all collateral attached to his name. I explained, my voice cold and unyielding. They seized his bank accounts, his investment portfolios, and all physical property residing at his primary address. That includes every diamond necklace, every designer handbag, and every single dollar of cash sitting in your personal safe upstairs. She started shaking violently. "No," she stammered, gripping the frame of the front door. "No, that is my personal property. They cannot take my things for his debt. My parents gave me some of those jewels. You cannot do this." Desmond adjusted his glasses and delivered the final, devastating blow. "The shadow bank did not want to deal with federal scrutiny after the FBI raid," Desmond said. "So they quietly sold the defaulted debt to an anonymous private holding company for pennies on the dollar. That holding company executed the immediate seizure of all assets." Vanessa looked back and forth between me and Desmond. The horrible realization slowly dawned on her face. She realized exactly who owned the anonymous holding company. "You," she whispered, her voice trembling with absolute horror. "You bought the debt." I looked down at her. I looked at the woman who had tried to drug me, the woman who had plotted to lock me in a psychiatric ward, the woman who called my heritage ghetto trash. "I own the debt, Vanessa," I said, my voice echoing off the marble walls, "which means I own the collateral. I own your jewelry. I own your cars. I own your designer clothes. Technically, I even own the torn dress you are wearing right now. But because I am a generous man from the South Side, I am going to let you keep the dress." She let out a guttural sound of pure despair. She lunged forward, trying to claw her way past me to get to the stairs. She was screaming, crying, and begging for her diamonds. She said she needed the money to pay her defense lawyers. She said her parents cut her off, and she had absolutely nothing left. I grabbed her by the shoulder of her ruined gown and pushed her firmly backward. She stumbled out the front door and landed hard on her knees on the freezing stone porch. I looked down at her, shivering and crying on the ground. She was completely broken, stripped of every single material possession that gave her false superiority. "I told you yesterday that your era was over," I said, looking down at her weeping form. You wanted to steal my empire to fund your vanity. Now you are leaving my property with absolutely nothing but the criminal charges waiting for you in federal court." I reached out and grabbed the heavy brass handle of the front door. "Do not ever come back to my house," I said. I slammed the massive mahogany door shut, locking it with a heavy, resounding click. I stood in my quiet foyer, listening to her muffled screams from the other side of the wood. She pounded on the door for 5 minutes before finally giving up. I walked over to the security monitors and watched her drag herself up from the stone porch. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering violently in the Chicago wind, and began the long, humiliating walk down the driveway entirely alone. The parasite was finally removed and my house was completely clean. The dust from the FBI raid had barely settled over Chicago when my private security alerted me that I had an uninvited guest. I was sitting in the main study of my estate, enjoying the profound silence of a house finally cleansed of parasites. Desmond was sitting across from me, reviewing the successful transfer of our assets into Obsidian Trust. The intercom buzzed. My head of security informed me that Arthur Vance was at the front gate demanding to see me. He had 2 expensive lawyers with him, and he was threatening to bring the local police if I did not let him inside. I told my security to leave the lawyers at the gate, but to let Vance walk up to the house alone. I wanted him to feel the exact same long, humiliating walk that Vanessa had experienced just 24 hours ago. 10 minutes later, Arthur Vance marched into my study. He was wearing a dark gray suit and trying desperately to project the image of an untouchable billionaire predator. But I could see the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. The FBI raid at the gala had spooked him. He had barely escaped being indicted along with my foolish son. But Vance was an arrogant man who had spent his entire life believing that his wealth and his political connections gave him a permanent shield against consequences. He thought he could still bully his way out of a corner. He did not wait for an invitation to speak. He stood in the center of my study and pointed a shaking finger at me. He told me I had made a massive mistake humiliating him in front of the mayor and the city elite. He said Derek might be rotting in a federal holding cell, but the backdoor deal they made was still conceptually valid in the eyes of the city zoning board. He boasted that he still owned the local politicians and the building commissioners. He threatened to use every single ounce of his political leverage to completely freeze all of my construction permits on the south side. He promised to strangle my supply chain routes, tie up my new shell company in endless municipal litigation, and bleed my empire completely dry until I was forced to sell the land to him anyway. He leaned over my mahogany desk and demanded that I sign over the Southside development rights to his firm immediately. He said if I handed over the projects quietly, he would call off his political dogs and let me retire in peace. He thought he was delivering a lethal ultimatum. He thought he was still the apex predator in the room. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a single red manila folder. I placed it flat on the polished wood right in front of him. I looked at Vance and told him he had a very bad habit of underestimating the people he considered beneath him. I told him he spent the last 6 months so completely focused on manipulating my weak son and plotting to steal my company that he entirely forgot to protect his own backyard. Vance frowned, looking down at the red folder. He asked me what kind of garbage I was trying to pull. I kept my voice absolutely freezing and precise. I told him that building skyscrapers in downtown Chicago is an incredibly expensive game. I told him I knew his real estate firm had been dangerously over-leveraged for the past 3 years. He had taken out massive commercial loans to fund his luxury high-rises on the north side. He was surviving on borrowed time and mezzanine debt from high-risk lenders. I explained that when the FBI raided the Palmer House Gala and his name was publicly linked to a massive federal wire fraud conspiracy, his creditors panicked. Traditional banks do not like bad press, and shadow lenders do not like federal heat. In the last 48 hours, his lenders started looking for a way to quietly dump his debt before his company went completely under. I tapped the red folder with my index finger. I told him that while he was busy threatening my son and trying to steal my legacy, Desmond and I were busy making international phone calls. I used the liquid capital from my secure offshore accounts and the newly insulated equity of Obsidian Trust to quietly purchase every single one of his outstanding commercial loans. Vance's face went completely blank. His arrogant posture crumbled in an instant. He stared at me as if I had just spoken to him in a foreign language. I spelled it out for him so there could be no misunderstandings. I told him I bought his debt. I bought the mortgages on his commercial properties. I bought the financing notes on his luxury high-rises. I told him that as of 9 o'clock this morning, Calvin Sterling was officially the majority debt holder of the entire Vance real estate empire. I owned him. He started shaking his head, denying the reality of the situation. He stammered that it was impossible and that his lawyers would block the transfer. He said I did not have the authority to call in those notes. Desmond stepped out of the shadows of the study holding a tablet. Desmond read aloud the specific default clauses embedded in Vance's original loan contracts. The clauses clearly stated that any public implication in a federal criminal investigation constituted an immediate breach of the morality and stability agreements. The debt could be called in completely and immediately upon transfer. I looked Vance dead in the eye and delivered the final fatal blow. I told him I was calling in the entire balance of his debt right now. I demanded immediate payment in full. If he could not produce the hundreds of millions of dollars he owed me by the end of the business day, I would legally seize every single building he had ever constructed. I would bankrupt his firm, strip his name off his towers, and leave him with absolutely nothing. The realization hit him like a freight train. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly. The powerful, untouchable billionaire was suddenly gasping for air, gripping the edge of my desk just to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. He realized he was standing in the very room of the man who held his entire life in the palm of his hand. He looked at me with pure, desperate terror and asked me what I wanted. He begged me not to destroy his firm. He said he would do whatever I asked. I opened the red folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the desk along with a heavy gold pen. I told him I wanted his complete surrender. I demanded he sign the legal document in front of him. The document formally relinquished all of his active bid zoning claims and developmental rights on the south side of Chicago, permanently transferring them to Obsidian Trust. But that was not all. I told him that once he signed the paper, he had exactly 1 week to step down as the head of his company, liquidate his personal shares, and leave the city of Chicago forever. I told him if I ever saw his face in my city again, I would execute the debt seizure and leave him to die in the streets. Vance stared at the paper. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely pick up the pen. He looked at me, trying to find a single shred of mercy in my eyes. He found absolutely none. I was the old fox of the South Side, and I was completely eradicating the threat to my community. He lowered his head completely, broken and defeated. He put the pen to the paper and signed away his power, his territory, and his entire presence in the city. When he finished, I pulled the paper back and placed it securely in my drawer. I told him to get out of my house and start packing his bags. Vance turned around and walked out of my study. His shoulders slumped, his spirit completely crushed. He looked exactly like the pathetic old man he and Derek had tried so desperately to turn me into. He walked down the long hallway and I heard the heavy front door click shut behind him. The war was officially over. I had protected my legacy, secured my community, and eliminated my oldest enemy, all without raising my voice. 6 months had passed since the night the sky fell on my treacherous son and his toxic wife. The brutal Chicago winter had finally broken, giving way to a bright and clear spring morning. My sprawling estate was incredibly quiet now. It was no longer a hunting ground for greedy relatives waiting like vultures for me to take my last breath. The air inside my home felt completely clean and entirely sterilized of their venomous presence. I heard through Desmond that Derek was currently settling into a cold concrete cell in a federal penitentiary where he would be spending the next 15 years of his life. His custom Italian suits and gold fountain pens had been permanently traded for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit and a metal food tray. Vanessa had met an equally fitting fate. Her wealthy parents had completely cut her off, refusing to let her highly publicized federal scandal drag down their immaculate country club reputation. Without my money to steal and without her parents to bail her out, she was currently living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the far outskirts of the city, working as a shift manager at a discount retail store. She had walked out of my house with absolutely nothing, and the world had quickly and ruthlessly forgotten she ever existed. This morning I did not reach for a cheap polyester suit. I did not lean on a heavy wooden cane, and I certainly did not let my hands tremble. I stood in front of my large bedroom mirror and put on a bespoke charcoal wool suit tailored perfectly to my frame. I adjusted a deep burgundy silk tie and slid my heavy gold Patek Philippe watch onto my left wrist. I looked at the 72-year-old man staring back at me in the glass. He was not a fragile, fading fossil ready for a nursing home. He was a king who had just successfully defended his crown against the ultimate betrayal. My driver was waiting out front with the engine of the black town car humming quietly. We did not drive to the old Sterling Logistics headquarters. That building and that company name had been completely liquidated to satisfy the shadow banking syndicate after Derek's spectacular public default. Instead, we drove to a towering, sleek glass high-rise in the absolute center of the financial district. This was the heavily fortified home of Obsidian Trust. The massive invisible shell company Desmond and I had built in the dark was now fully stepping into the blazing light. Obsidian Trust held every single asset, every warehouse deed, every heavy transport truck, and every lucrative city contract that I had surgically removed from my old company. The empire was not just perfectly intact, it was completely sterilized, reorganized, and exponentially stronger than it had ever been. I walked through the revolving glass doors of the new building. My spine was perfectly straight and my strides were long and commanding. The security guards stood at strict attention and nodded with deep, genuine respect as I passed. The lobby buzzed with the focused, aggressive energy of a company that was hungry to build the future. There were no entitled executives walking around wasting company money on expensive lunches or offshore mistresses. Everyone in this building was here to work. They knew the legendary story of what had happened to the previous vice president, and they knew that the man who built this empire from the mud of the South Side did not tolerate a single ounce of betrayal. I took the private secure elevator up to the penthouse executive suite. The heavy mahogany doors slid open, revealing a sprawling corner office that overlooked the entire sprawling grid of Chicago. Standing by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows reviewing a digital financial tablet was Maya. 6 months ago, she was hiding in the basement accounting pool, a brilliant young black woman entirely ignored by a foolish, arrogant boss. Today, she was wearing an immaculate navy blue business suit, projecting absolute confidence and undeniable authority. She looked up when I walked in and smiled warmly, setting her tablet down on the polished glass desk. I walked over to the custom wet bar in the corner of the room and poured 2 generous measures of an aged Kentucky bourbon into heavy crystal glasses. I walked back over and handed one of the glasses to Maya. I stood next to her, looking out the massive window, staring down at the distant neighborhoods of the South Side where both of our stories had begun. I told her that the new affordable housing development contracts had just been officially approved by the city council without a single hurdle. Now that Arthur Vance was permanently exiled from Chicago and stripped of his political leverage, our community was finally getting the massive financial investment and the robust protection it truly deserved. We were building community centers, clinics, and safe housing right over the exact same blocks where I used to hustle just to buy dinner. Maya took a slow sip of her bourbon and told me the financial projections for the next quarter were breaking every single profit record we had on file. I turned to face her, and I told her that building an empire from nothing is only half the battle. The absolute hardest part of having power is finding someone worthy enough to help you keep it. I told her I spent 40 years trying to hand my legacy to a son who only wanted to tear it down and sell it to my enemies. I told her she had risked her own safety, her career, and her future to protect a company and a community she deeply believed in. She had the street smarts of the South Side and the brilliant tactical mind of a corporate predator. I raised my crystal glass and officially welcomed her as the new executive vice president of Obsidian Trust. I told her this corner office was officially hers, and that I expected her to run the day-to-day operations of this empire with the exact same ruthless precision she used to take down my corrupt son. Maya clinked her glass against mine. She did not give me a tearful, emotional speech. She just looked me dead in the eye and promised me that the South Side would never fall to predators as long as she was sitting in this executive chair. That was the exact moment I knew my massive legacy was finally completely secure. I had found my true heir, and she did not need to share my bloodline to share my ultimate vision. I walked back over to my own desk in the adjacent office and sat down in my heavy leather chair. I took a slow, smooth sip of the dark bourbon, letting the familiar burn settle deep in my chest. I looked down at the sprawling concrete and steel landscape of Chicago. The fierce, icy winds were blowing off Lake Michigan, but inside this room the atmosphere was perfectly calm. The terrible storm had finally passed. The cancer had been aggressively cut out and the wounds were fully healed. My empire was alive and breathing with a new, powerful rhythm. They say blood is thicker than water, but betrayal breeds a poison that no bloodline can cure. In my 72 years from the gritty streets of the South Side to the velvet-lined boardrooms, I learned one unforgiving truth. Respect is not inherited, it is earned. And when the very hands you nurtured try to dig your grave, you do not lie down. You let them dig, then you legally and ruthlessly bury their arrogance inside it. True power is not measured by the volume of your shouts, but by the devastating silence of your final move. Never underestimate an old king. If this story resonated with you and you believe that loyalty and respect are the true foundations of a family, hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice, truth, and the power of standing your ground. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.